Hey everyone, how's it going? Matthew Kadish here, author, evil genius, and someone who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. And today we're going to be talking about pulp fiction, pulp noir, and a movie that I really enjoyed back when it came out. It's kind of like a guilty pleasure because I don't think it's a very good movie, but at the same time, it has a lot of elements to it that I really like and I like to revisit from time to time. And that is, of course, the 1994 Alec Baldwin starring film, The Shadow, a movie that resurrects a very iconic pulp figure from, the golden age of pulp fiction. And today I've gathered an expert panel to talk about not only this movie, but also pulp fiction in general, and how it should be written and how it should be applied. And we also talk about some neo-noir elements and stuff like that. So let me introduce my expert panel to begin with. The first person I'd like to introduce you to is J.J. Hatter. And J.J. Hatter is a gentleman who I stumbled upon on YouTube who had some very excellent insights into The Shadow. And he might know a thing or two about it. How you doing, J.J.?
I guess I know some things.
And probably the biggest expert I've ever met on The Shadow, the one, the only, the man himself, the Rageaholic, Razorfist. Razorfist, why don't you introduce yourself?
Just a super fan, quite frankly. I am a gamer, ranter, ballerina, and one of 5 able-bodied males on the North American continent who has never hosted the Family Feud. So there we go.
Quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, funny story. When I was in 3rd grade, I actually auditioned for the Family Feud. So
did you?
I did, yeah.
Clap your hands and say, "Good answer! Good answer!"
Yeah, we the whole family went down there and we auditioned, and it was a real crap show, to tell you the truth. But
yeah. A bunch of people standing around pretending Steve Harvey's funny.
Oh well, this was before Steve Harvey. This was back when a white guy was hosting the show.
Oh, Louis Anderson.
No, even before him. This was, we're talking late 80s here. So
okay, so Richard Dawson still.
Yeah. All right. So enough about Family Feud. Let's talk about what we're here to talk about, which is The Shadow.
Has been a Family Feud question, however.
So what I want to ask you guys is, first off, I like to kind of start these things by giving people kind of some background on our relationship with the movie and the people involved in it. So what I want to ask you guys is, what is your background with the character of the Shadow and what makes him so appealing to you? So Razor, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, I suppose it sort of comes down to my abiding affection for Universal monster movies. I remember there being a period when I was a little kid where I was going just on a tear. Every Friday, my dad would pick me up from school, and every day he'd have a new VHS tape of an old black and white Universal monster movie, right? And we were just moving through them all, right? So we started with Dracula, we moved to Frankenstein, we moved to the Mummy, and so on and so forth. Well, we finally got to Phantom of the Opera. Oh, I love the Phantom of the Opera, right? And there's some talk that there's a character in the Phantom of the Opera that was kind of a vague early inspiration for the creation of the Shadow and so forth. And we're talking in the original source material. But it's interesting, like after getting into sort of the Phantom of the Opera, suddenly, this was in the 90s, of course, because I'm a 90s kid. And I remember seeing on television, holy crap, there's this new like superhero movie that looks really dark and really weird. And it's for this character called the Shadow. And he looks like the Phantom of the Opera, only fights crime. And that was it, man. I dressed as the Shadow that year. Of course, I got it kind of wrong. I kind of mixed him with the Phantom of the Opera. I had the little mask thing going on, and but I had the cape, I had the fedora, I had the whole 9 yards, and of course the Payless sneakers to go along with it, because you got to complete the ensemble. But that was kind of my introduction to it. Then of course the action figures and stuff, and then that movie kind of fell off the map. There was supposed to be a video game. I mean, I believe there was a whole multimedia franchise planned around the Shadow in 1994, and when the movie was a disappointment, it's funny, you look at the box office, it doesn't look that disappointing, but I guess Universal had much higher expectations. And back then, when movies still made money, they could afford to be persnickety about it. So, I probably would have gotten into the character even more if that multimedia franchise had actually taken off. But it didn't. So it sort of fell by the wayside, like a lot of things when you're a little kid. And then later on, when I was an adult, I was volunteering, actually. I was doing volunteer work at a food bank. And this food bank, for whatever reason, had taken a bunch of donations from a comic book store that was going out of business. And there was a Shadow graphic novel called The Shadow 1941 Hitler's Astrologer. And it's by Denny O'Neil and the great Michael Kaluta, the definitive Shadow artist as far as the comics go for me. And so basically, as an adult, I now re-encountered the Shadow, and this comic, unbelievable artwork. It's historical fiction. It's the Shadow versus Nazis. Who doesn't want that? It was masterful. It's one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. I recommended it in my first Shadow video on my channel. And so the Shadow from that point on was, right up there with Daredevil in terms of my favorite American superheroes. And he's really in a class all his own in terms of the genesis of American comics, and certainly the pulp Avenger subgenre, of which Punisher and certainly Batman, as we'll no doubt talk about, they all owe a rather large debt to. So that was sort of my, I sort of had two baptisms into the Shadow.
All right, JJ, Mr. Hatter, why don't you tell us what your background is with the character?
Well, it's funny you should start with saying about Batman. Because that's kind of how I got introduced. I was actually born the same year this movie came out. So I saw it when I was a kid, but it was kind of something I saw off and on TV when it was released to TV. The real introduction I had to the Shadow when I first really became aware of the character was there was a book published in 1999. I actually didn't get it until I think like 2002 or something. It was almost out of print by that point, simply called The History of Batman. And it was exactly that. It covered the history of Batman up to 1999. There was a whole section in this History of Batman book about the Shadow. Because he was one of the quote-unquote inspirations for the character. I, of course, later found out what that really meant. And something about that section just really interested me. I was like, who is the Shadow? And so I ended up looking up the radio show, and I watched the Alec Baldwin movie. And kind of like with the Razor, sometime in my life, it just fell off the grid. I just didn't see the movie very much. I didn't listen to the radio show for a long time. Never really bothered to look at the comics or anything. And actually, it was only about 5 or 6 years ago that I kind of got back into it because, once again, because of Batman, there was a DVD set that had the old 40s serials of Batman and Robin. And it also came with the 1940 Columbia serial of The Shadow starring Victor Jory. And I bought that, and I ended up watching it in chronological order. So I watched Victor Jory's Shadow first. And it was 5 billion times better than either of the Batman serials. And from the moment I watched it, I just kind of went nuts. I started looking at comics. I rewatched the Alec Baldwin film. I started listening to the radio show a lot more, and it kind of hasn't dropped off since. So yeah, I kind of also had two baptisms, but I don't consider myself an expert because I really only got obsessive about the Shadow within the last few years. And there's still a lot more I have to read and look at. For example, I've only read 2 of the pulps. Oh, strike that, 3. I read 3 of the pulps. So if anyone has questions about those, I suggest talking to Razor, not me.
Well, it's kind of funny that you got into it through Batman, because that was kind of my experience as well, where I think right after Batman Returns came out, so I've always been a huge Batman fan. When I was a very little kid, my dad was stationed in Germany. He was in the Air Force, and there was this little grocery store on base that my mom would take me and my brother to go grocery shopping, and there was this little stand with comic books. And they were like the only English language things that we had real access to were these comic books. And she'd buy me Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and stuff like that. So I was a big Batman fan growing up. And around the time that Batman Returns came out, I discovered The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. And that thing blew my mind. And I became obsessed with Batman during this phase. I started researching him, much like you did, JJ, and found out that he was inspired by the Shadow. And so, like, I got into the Shadow. I learned about the radio show, and I learned about the books and stuff like that. And when it was announced that they were making a movie, I was really gung-ho about, seeing this movie. And I remember I was 16 years old when I went and saw it in the theater. And I was very disappointed with what I saw back then. But at the same time, it's kind of a guilty pleasure movie of mine, where I really like the sensibilities of the movie, and I really like the look of the film and the ideas in it and stuff like that. And as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate the movie a little bit more than I did back when I was 16. But why don't we talk about the movie going forward? So what I want to know now is, what are your general thoughts about the film version of The Shadow, and do you think it did the character justice? Mr. Hatter, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, my overall thoughts are, actually, I really, really, really like the movie. I don't think it's perfect. The Shadow, for example, when he first meets Shiwan Khan, well, doesn't first meet him, but when he has his final encounter with Shiwan Khan, he walks into the room, pulls out his guns, and the very next scene, he flops over like he slipped on a banana peel. Not the best action. But other than that, I really like most of it beyond that. I like the actors, I like the costumes and the sets and the style of it. I also like the story. So overall, I'd say I enjoy it a great deal. I just wish the action was a little better, and that maybe a few other things were slightly looked into more.
Which is interesting that you mentioned that, actually, because what a lot of Shadow fans don't realize is, well, I don't know, hardcore Shadow fans are probably aware, but there was a comic book adaptation of the movie that came out concurrently with the movie, right?
Yes, I know. I haven't read it.
Written and drawn by Michael Kaluta, who's
yes,
like the Shadow guy. And the interesting thing is, it's basically it's based on an alternate script, an earlier version of the script. So apparently that whole sequence, there was supposed to be a whole shootout, and a bunch of henchmen were supposed to fly at the Shadow, and like that whole sequence is drawn in the comic. But somehow, whether it was just they were editing things out, I got to believe there's a director's cut of some kind of this movie with a bunch of stuff that was removed for whatever reason. But apparently there was supposed to be a lengthy action sequence there before that happened.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Razor, what were your thoughts on the movie in general?
Well, it's interesting. I should have probably specified this. Even though the movie came out when I was a little kid, my parents were very, very protective and religious, so they didn't actually let me go see it. It was PG-13. I was not 13 years old. I was a little kid. So I was not able to see it in theaters. I only encountered this movie as an adult. So I was sort of unencumbered by the nostalgia. I don't consider it a guilty pleasure at all. I think it's the best. There is a trilogy of pulp hero movies in the 90s, even though one of them is technically not a pulp hero. And that's, of course, The Rocketeer, The Phantom, and The Shadow. And The Shadow is the best of all three, by far. And it's not even close. It's way better than Rocketeer. It's way better than Phantom. And I love both those movies. But The Phantom is just head over heels above them. I think what really kind of strains it a little bit, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, is the collector's edition, which I actually have, a collector's edition Blu-ray that just came out from Shout Factory. It has some special features on it, and they talk about how they were really strapped for money. Like, even though Universal wanted this to be this huge multimedia franchise, it was like Universal was trying to get something for nothing. That I don't know if they looked at the property and said, oh, street level hero, we don't have to spend that much. And maybe David Koepp's script was just a little bigger or whatever it is. But it feels like they gave a ground level budget to a very elaborate, big budget comic book script. And I think that's, if those two things were sort of at odds, because if you look at the budget for the movie, it's really not that high for the time, and that kind of screwed them, from what I understand in watching the special features. But I unironically enjoy the film. I agree with JJ there. I think it has very real tonal inconsistencies, and some of that is extrapolation from Alec Baldwin. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. You know, Alec Baldwin, from what I understand, was allowed to work with the script writers a little bit to insert humor or whatever. There's nothing wrong with having humor in a Shadow movie. The Shadow should probably not be the one divulging the humor, though. It should probably be someone else, which is why it's so odd, because in this movie, I mean, the Shadow could have been... Here's the thing. For hardcore purist Shadow fans, a lot of them like boo and hiss when they hear about this movie. But the truth is, this could have been so much worse. It could have been so much worse. We got the literal representation of the Shadow, the physical manifestation that we saw on the cover of the pulp comics. Like, that's the version we got on the screen, physically, right? His costume's exactly right. The actor's pretty good. Alec Baldwin is a perfectly fine Lamont Cranston, whatever. I wish he was Kent Allard, but, you know, whatever. Beggars can't be choosers. Margo Lane was very, very good. We got the agents. I mean, for crying out loud, there's a whole sequence with Burbank, who's not just an agent, but an obscure agent. And he's in his little area with his steampunk tubes. And there's kind of a cool sequence there with all the pneumatic tubes that go over New York and so forth. So, like, I think we got a fairly good version of the Shadow, to be perfectly honest. It's just because it's a bit of an artifact of its time, superhero movies were not taken terribly seriously at this time. So they added some levity where they probably shouldn't have. This probably should have been a much more grim, dark affair, but they were looking to Batman. They were looking to what Russell Mulcahy had done before. And I think within the strictures they were working in, I think it's a fantastic movie. Like I said, it's the best of those three pulp hero movies, in my humble opinion.
Well, I would have to agree with you. I did not think The Phantom was good at all. And,
Agreed.
And,
it's an underrated movie. I like that movie.
The Rocketeer is a decent enough film.
Yeah.
But you know, he was an original creation, even though he was set in that kind of pulp time.
Right.
So, you know, we talked about the character of the Shadow. Let's talk about, you know, some of the supporting characters in here. You know, you guys already mentioned like Margo Lane and some of the agents. But there are a number of supporting actors who kind of brought these characters to life in this film. And I want to know what you thought of the use of the supporting cast and the actors who portrayed them. So, I mean, in this movie, we got people like Tim Curry, Jonathan Winters, Ian McKellen, Peter Boyle, all very well-known actors at the time.
The guy who plays Burbank is a very famous actor, Andre
Gregory.
Yeah, very like there's some famous people in very inconsequential roles here.
Yeah, and I think that was probably one of my biggest gripes about the film is that you have these fantastic actors, and a lot of their roles are kind of just, you know, shunted to the side. In fact, it's funny going back and rewatching it, because there are a lot of actors who you recognize, a lot of character actors in there. I think the guy who played Neelix in Star Trek Voyager is the museum's security guard who Shiwan Khan ends up killing and stuff like that. So Razorfist, what did you think of the supporting cast in this movie, and do you think they were utilized well?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's some great actors in relatively inconsequential roles. I think Tim Curry's role is underrated, though, I have to say. I think he's way better, and his role is way better than he was given credit for at the time, and is usually given credit for. Go back and watch that movie again. It's surprising how much of the scenery he chews, given how little he actually has to work with. You know what I mean? Yeah, like in terms of the supporting characters, Peter Boyle is great as Shrevey. I mean, for crying out loud, who would have been better for Shrevey? If you make another Shadow movie, it's funny to think, but if they have a Shrevey, he's literally going to be in the shadow of Peter Boyle, because Peter Boyle was great as the cabbie there, pretty much exactly as he's described in the pulp novels. There's even sort of a one-off story in The Shadow Strikes, which was a really good DC Comics ongoing series, probably the best, actually. And it's all about Shrevey. Actually, no, I think it's a two-shot. And it's all about Shrevey and a corrupt union boss, and him sort of uncovering this whole thing. The version of Shrevey in there, very similar to Peter Boyle. in this movie. So I thought that was a pretty much a 1-to-1. Burbank was fantastic. That kind of cold, remote delivery. But again, it's not much. You know, it's a great actor. I guess the only thing that I would say in defense of those like minor roles for big actors is that with the agents, less is more. You know, with the agents, they fulfill a specific role, unless it is Harry Vincent, who is sort of the number 2 guy, or maybe Cliff Marsland, someone like that. Or if you want to gender swap Margo Lane, you know, those are the ones that you want to hear the most from, because those are essentially, in the good pulp novels, those are the emotional surrogates. The whole idea behind the Shadow is this remote, almost Dracula kind of character. And it's the agents that provide the emotional impetus for the story. They're sort of the emissaries to the reader and the audience. That, I think, is what this movie's missing. And so you've got all these great supporting actors. You've basically got all the key agents of the Shadow, or at least some kind of allusion to them. In fact, you have a pretty faithful recreation of the discussion between Harry Vincent and the Shadow in the very first Shadow Pulp magazine, The Living Shadow, only it takes place between Roy Tam, who is an agent of the Shadow and the pulps as well. And it's pretty much the same, you know, your life is no longer your own, it belongs to me now. That is a 1-to-1 quote from the Walter Gibson pulps. But the problem is these agents are not, like, we don't follow Roy Tam and see through his eyes how weird and remote the Shadow is. He is never our emotional surrogate. Instead, because it's the 90s, because we have to give every superhero pathos, because we're basically, in a massive ironic twist, we're copying Tim Burton Batman, who's in turn a copy of the Shadow. We've essentially decided to confer all of that pathos upon the Shadow, instead of letting him be that remote, shadowy figure, that thing that we don't always want completely explained. That I think is where they missed the boat. So when you're talking about the supporting cast, that's kind of where what I immediately think about is just the fact that you have all these agents, but none of them are fulfilling their primary function, which is to be the emotion of the story.
Mr. Hatter, what are your thoughts on the supporting cast of this movie?
Well, my thoughts are more about the actors themselves and the characters they play, if that makes sense. Like Razor, I do think they actually do a very good job with the characters they play. I love Peter Boyle as Moshe V. Shrivnitz. In terms of Tim Curry as his character, I totally agree. I'm amazed the set was still standing after he finished chewing on it. But and I have to say right now, Tim Curry is one of my icons. He's one of the people who made me want to be an actor. So I have immense respect for him. So seeing him in anything is automatically, it's like, oh, good, a lucky talisman. I like Penelope Ann Wilson as Margo Lane, and I thought they did a really good job with her. Andre Gregory, tiny role as Burbank, but it was nice to see him and nice to see the character. Incidentally, because it goes with the name, I know Andre Gregory first encountered him as playing the Mad Hatter in a version of Alice in Wonderland. Anyway, what I feel is interesting is that I feel it's the actors who really make these characters come alive, because there is this kind of this balance you have to find. You put these big name, incredibly talented actors into these very small parts. True, but on the other hand, they're part of what makes those parts memorable. If you had gotten anyone but Peter Boyle to play Shrivi, I don't think we'd care as much about Mo in this movie. If you had gotten anyone but Ian McKellen to play Margot's father, I don't think we care as much about him. You could have gotten smaller actors, you could have gotten other people, but I think it's the fact that you got these people who put so much effort and so much love into what they did, or at least tried to have a lot of fun with it, that makes them come alive. So that even if they don't always fill their function, even if they aren't the main characters and aren't always the focus, what they do with what they have is extremely interesting and fun to watch. I guess if I have any complaint, it's that I wish Burbank in particular we could have seen a little bit more of, because I don't think we even heard his name. And as far as Tim Curry goes, am I the only one who thinks that he and Ian McKellen are having a constant fight throughout the movie of who can do the worst American accent? I love them both, but it's just something that always made me laugh.
Yeah, it doesn't even seem like Ian McKellen's trying. Like he's peering into the
There's a
British.
few moments where he's trying, but but it doesn't work.
Right.
And then Tim Curry like tries for like 5 seconds and goes, "Oh, who cares?"
Right.
I'm Frankenfurter. No one's going to bother.
Yeah, it is funny that Tim Curry just is very over the top in this movie, but the actor that actually I guess bugs me the most in this film is Jonathan Winters.
Yes,
he plays the chief of police, who's also Lamont Cranston's I guess uncle or something like that. And I think Jonathan Winters is great. He's a fantastic comedic talent. But I felt like he was so underutilized in this film that it was almost like, why did you cast Jonathan Winters in this role? He's not doing anything that Jonathan Winters would normally do. So it felt kind of like an odd casting choice to me. But I felt like all the other supporting characters were very well done. It kind of brought some flavor to the movie. But John Lone as Shiwan Khan, I also think did a fantastic job.
yes.
I don't think his character was very well done. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think like the performance he gave for what he had to work with was really good.
Yeah. And that's a guy who at one time, I mean, it was like that guy's the next Oscar buzz dude for a little while. In fact, around the time of this movie. And he's a weird cat. Apparently he kind of fell off the face of the earth after that. Sort of.
Yeah. He did a few really big movies and then just kind of fizzled out. And I don't even know if he's done anything since.
Massively talented actor and really good in this movie.
Yeah, it is kind of weird that he just kind of disappeared. But I guess that's a deep dive for another day. So obviously in 1994, The Shadow was an attempt to start a franchise around this character, no doubt inspired by the success of the Batman films by Tim Burton, because this movie actually came out before Joel Schumacher started his run on the movies.
And was in development even before Batman 89.
Yeah.
Walter Gibson, in one of his last interviews, talked about how they were hounding him for, a Shadow movie and all the buzz. I mean, all throughout the 80s, they were trying to get this thing made. Finally, they get Russell Mulcahy, the Highlander guy, to do it.
Well, the irony here is that the character of Batman was actually heavily inspired by the Shadow. In fact, some might even say, that the character was a blatant ripoff.
Some of those who can read.
So what I want to ask you guys is, what do you think audiences, or what do you think is the appeal of these two characters, Batman and the Shadow? And why do you think audiences have responded so much more favorably to the character of Batman than they have to the character of the Shadow over time? Mr. Hatter, Razorfist, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I forgot you were going to throw these questions to me.
Mr. Hatter, what do you think?
Well, to start with the question of why these characters are appealing together in general, this may sound a bit pretentious, but I think the phrase of the day is avenging angels. And that's something that I think goes to a lot of superhero fiction and pulp crime fiction in general, is that they're kind of the characters who we want to be our saviors. They're the ones who we kind of wish we could be or could have in our real world, even though they don't always necessarily work. And I think that applies to both Batman and the Shadow. Both are characters who work in the shadows. Both are characters who come at night. So they have this kind of this mysterious, foggy quality to them. And we kind of wish we could have those people who work from the sidelines to make the world a better place in some way, even if to break the rules. Now, as to why Batman's more popular, I think there's two reasons. One, he belongs to DC. And frankly, DC is one of the biggest comic companies ever. And the Shadow did belong to DC for a time, but I think by the time they got hold of him, he was kind of on the downgrade. Batman had been on the upgrade for years and years and years. And I think that because of that he just gets pushed more and thus is more popular. It's as simple as that. But I think the other reason, and some may disagree, but judging from what I've seen in general, I feel that Batman is able to, I don't know how to put it, transcend time more easily than the Shadow. Because we've seen stories where the Shadow is put into the modern day, or at least close to the modern day, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Batman has managed to survive for years with people changing him for the times, from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s. And some versions are better than others, but the fact that he can fit into almost any time period, any universe, I think speaks a lot to why he might be more popular. And as opposed to the Shadow, who I think you could do a really good, more modern take on him if you tried, but it just seems to be very difficult to handle because anytime people try it, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And it kind of depends on who's holding the pencil. You can do a story like there was a graphic novel. Why can't I remember it now? It came out in the 80s.
The Shadow, Blood and Judgment.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to say Blood and Thunder, and I was like, no, that's not it. The
Right.
Shadow, Blood and Judgment, and that took place in like a case where the Shadow had been gone for years and then came back, and that worked really well. But then you look at going back to DC, they did this run with the Shadow where he like had his head mounted on a robot. No, that doesn't work. That's not a good way to put the Shadow in the modern day at all.
Right.
And so it really depends on who's handling him. With Batman, even though some versions are better than others just naturally, the fact that he seems to be more easily able to slip into different time periods, even to the point where they've had like stories where like he's in like Victorian times fighting Jack the Ripper, I think shows that that might be part of it as well. Yeah. And that's all I've got.
Mr. Fist, I know you have a lot to say about this. So why do you think Batman has overshadowed the Shadow, which he was completely based on? And why do you think the Shadow has had such a hard time kind of breaking into that mainstream success?
Well, I think first off, you have to understand this isn't a character looking for mainstream success. This is a character who had a kind of pop culture success that was unprecedented and still is, even today. Batman will only equal the Shadow's movie total when, you know, the long canceled, delayed Ben Affleck movie is finally released of 7 movies or whatever. Batman's only going to equal that this decade. The Shadow had 6 or 7 movies before the 40s were over. So he was popular. He was popular. He was more popular than most comic heroes are now. And it was more than just that. It was #1 radio program. It was one of the top selling comics, which had hundreds of issues. It was the top selling, Pulp Avenger, Pulp Story magazine or whatever. That was, 300 plus issues, most of them written by the same guy. You know what I mean? Multiple attempts at bringing him to television. An incredibly successful radio serial that not only was super successful in its own right, but brought back the superhero serial in a way because it had been dead for a little while, which is kind of a constant pattern with the Shadow. He tends to bring back dead art forms. I think the primary culprit really is ownership. Street and Smith were the people who created the Shadow. And when they went out of business in the late 40s, it wasn't but 5 more years that the radio show stayed on the air. And then when that was over, there was just this weird ownership shakeup. Okay, who owns the Street and Smith properties? There was actually a legal battle over it. Finally, all of that was purchased by Condé Nast. Now, Condé Nast, you need to look into. They're mostly just a massive publishing conglomerate. They're known for owning outlandish numbers of big imprint magazines like Cosmopolitan and stuff, like those kind of magazines, Time magazine and stuff. That's what Condé Nast does. The Shadow is a tiny little pebble on the beach of what they do. And that's kind of the issue. They treat the Shadow like a copyright piggy bank. They wait for companies to approach them, pay the licensing fee. And the problem then becomes, the company that's making the Shadow comic or movie or whatever has to shell out the money, so they have to make back a minimal return. And then if they want it to be sweepingly successful, it has to go above and beyond, which I think is part of the reason the 1994 film being a success, but not an earth-rending, sky-splitting success, equaled air quotes failure for Universal Studios, because they were already shelling out a fairly healthy stipend to Condé Nast to actually use the character. That, more than anything, has precluded the Shadow from making a long-term run, because what'll happen is, I mean, look no farther than The Shadow Strikes. Magnificent comic, right? But because DC's paying for it and it's not something they own, they're not going to push it as hard as Batman. You know what I mean? Like, that's not happening. The Batman, they get to keep all the money. So first few issues, hey, you know, new number 1 always sells pretty well. But, you know, after issue 5, 6, 7, but once you get into the teens on that, and the Shadow Strikes lasted longer than most. It was 20-something issues and a couple of annuals. But, you know, it gets to a certain number of issues and suddenly DC loses interest. The same thing has happened with Dynamite. You look at it, ever since the Shadow's been a licensed property instead of something that was owned by someone, it's been a case where we might get to 12 issues, we might get to 20 issues, and then it's not really worth it for us anymore, even though the character is embraced. The Shadow comic that Garth Ennis did in 2012, 2013 for Dynamite that I think is utterly abysmal. I
agree.
It was incredibly well received, and it sold pretty well too. But, you know, after a certain point, sales naturally fall off of comic magazines. It happens to Batman, for crying out loud. It happened with the new Frank Miller Batman comic. You know, the sales by issue 4 were nothing like what they were at issue 1, right? That's just what naturally happens. Well, when you own a character, you're going to weather that because you get to keep all the money. But with the Shadow, you have to split that money. So the less issues you're selling, the more you're thinking cancellation. And that has happened again and again. It happened with the Shadow at DC. It happened with the Shadow at Dark Horse. And it has happened. It appears to have happened at Dynamite. Dynamite doesn't appear to have any further plans for the Shadow. I'm not sure if they still have the license. Everyone's kind of up in the air on that. But I think another thing is that Batman, there has been a myth built about DC, and DC were pretty good about covering their plagiaristic tracks with regard to Batman. And one of the things they covered it up with was Batman created everything. There is a narrative created by DC where Batman's the first this, Batman's the first that, Batman's the, you know, like this narrative is out there. It's the first character of its kind. It's the, you know, they've been very successful at controlling that narrative. You watch any comic book documentary, and once they get to Batman, they can scarcely contain themselves. They can't keep their pants on. And that's another thing. I think if you're talking fictionally, though, with regard to Batman, Batman does have one advantage that the Shadow has, and maybe this is why the Shadow hasn't translated to other time periods. This is a very easily fixed malady, however, and that is that Batman exists outside of time. Batman exists in Gotham City. Gotham City is a bizarre amalgam of 1940s, like World's Fair and cyberpunk and modern day, and really whatever the artist and writer want Gotham City to look and feel like, that's what Gotham City looks and feels like. But there's kind of an innate, inborn, sort of Tim Burton-y kind of a vibe that Gotham City has always had, that Art Deco kind of big, sprawling urban metropolis feel. The Shadow doesn't have that. He doesn't have his Gotham. He's got New York City. So his version of New York City is in the 30s and 40s. Now, why that couldn't be relevant, I don't know. People still read Raymond Chandler books. You know, there are still movies set in the 30s and 40s all the freaking time. Peaky Blinders didn't seem to suffer too much from being set in a different time period. So I don't think it necessarily fossilizes the character, because the issues, it just so happens that the two primary time periods for the Shadow are the 30s and 40s. And what are the two big issues that are facing the country at that time? Depression, crime, right? Prohibition, and then World War. right? And then, of course, there's a whole pre-story there with Kent Allard and the Black Eagle and World War I and what have you. But like, that is a period that movie makers go to all the time, right? If Hollywood can shut up for 15 minutes about World War II, like, it's a good day. You know what I mean? So I don't think it's the time period holding The Shadow back so much as it is the way people handle it. I just recorded an episode of the Shadowcast, the new podcast that I'm doing, where I talked about how Michael Uslan, who you may know as the guy who has guided the Batman movies through, I mean, literally since the beginning, Burton movies on through Joel Schumacher, all through the Christian Bale stuff and what have you. Michael Uslan's been there since day one, but he's a massive Shadow fan. He wrote a crossover with the Shadow and the Green Hornet called The Shadow, Green Hornet, Dark Knights.
I love that comic.
I think it's Drek. I think it's terrible. And here's why I think it's Drek. Because I think Michael Uslan falls into the same pitfall that a lot of people do, which is he seems more interested in writing historical fiction where he wedges every historical figure conceived. I mean, in 2 issues, The Shadow encounters or mentions Adolf Hitler, Nikola Tesla, you know, Henry Ford.
That's a fair point.
He meets Howard Hughes. You know, he meets Woodrow and Edith Wilson in the very first panels. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like they're way more interested in writing historical fiction than writing a badass Shadow mystery or something, a story that could only be told using the Shadow. So I think Batman has that advantage. The writers are less tempted to do that because you're not tempted to wedge FDR into a Gotham City story because Gotham City could be any time, any place. Gotham City is in its own bubble.
All right. Well, that was way more in-depth of an answer than I expected from that question. But
sorry.
No,
it was say on that.
It was fascinating. So, you know, we talked about the character of the Shadow, but let's talk about the guy who portrayed him in the movie for a minute, because, you know, Alec Baldwin is really, I think, the thing that makes this movie stand out. But starting in the late 1980s with the film Hunt for Red October, Hollywood was really doing its best to try to push Alec Baldwin as a leading man, and it was putting him in headlining roles in films like The Marrying Man, Prelude to a Kiss, and The Getaway, which was kind of like the film that really pushed him to try to be an A-lister, I guess you'd say. And this movie, The Shadow, it was basically designed to be his big breakout role as a larger-than-life superhero, with writer David Koepp specifically writing the role with Alec Baldwin in mind. Now, despite the fact that Alec Baldwin is a really good actor, for some reason, audiences never really seemed to rally behind him as a leading man. And this kind of caused his career to stall for quite some time until he began taking on more supporting roles. And now he's like one of the greatest supporting character actors working in Hollywood. So what I want to ask you guys is, what did you think of Baldwin's portrayal as Lamont Cranston in the film? And do you think his involvement with the movie helped it or hurt it? And I also want to know, in addition to that, you know, barring Alec Baldwin as the Shadow, who do you think would be a good actor to play the character? So, Razor, why don't we start with you?
I think Alec Baldwin's fantastic in the movie, actually. And from what I understand, he was actually a fan of the Shadow. He didn't just, you know, it's very tempting for Shadow fans, especially, to look at Alec Baldwin and say, like, oh, he was just this big celebrity who took it on as a favor and they paid him a lot of money and he went through the motions and put a bunch of dick jokes in because that made him chuckle to himself and whatever. It really wasn't that way at all. Alec Baldwin loved the radio show and liked the comics and likes the character in general. I mean, really, he was a good choice for the character. That said, the script is what it is. And it doesn't really play to the strengths. It plays to the strengths of Alec Baldwin. It doesn't so much play to the strengths of Lamont Cranston, if that makes sense. Lamont Cranston is kind of a cold, diffident, sort of calculating customer. And you really don't get that from Alec Baldwin at all. He's almost too charming. Maybe because it was supposed to be a vehicle for Alec Baldwin, he kind of cranked up the charm. I don't think that's it. I think he looked at the script. I think it wasn't working to him, and he had some suggestions, and some of them work, some of them don't. I love the dialogue between him and Margo Lane in places. I think they actually did have some chemistry. A lot of people have said, oh, they had no chemistry. That takes the whole movie down. BS. I think they were fantastic together, actually. They're one of the few like relationships in the movie that actually work on some level. But, you know, the real problem, I think, is just he's wedging like one-liners and stuff in the like Schwarzenegger one-liners. And like he at one point, he knocks a Mongol warrior over the edge of like the edge of a building, and he lands on a gargoyle, and the shadow lands on top of him. So he like uses him as a cushion. And the guy dies, of course, immediately on impact. And he says, next time I get to be on top, which makes no sense because he's already on top. But it's, you know, the whole thing, like you can tell that was something Alec Baldwin put in. And they talked about that in the collector's edition, that he put little things like that in there. Like I said, sometimes it works, like in the exchanges with Margo Lane. Other times it's that. Other times it seems like it should be in a canon film.
JJ, what do you think about Alec Baldwin in the role, and who do you think would have, been a good alternative to him?
Well, as far as Baldwin in the role goes for this movie, I also really, really like him. I also basically agree with Razor. I actually did a list on my DeviantArt channel where I've got various lists of my favorites of everything, just everything, movies, TV shows, characters, just whatever. I did a list of my 5 favorite people to play the Shadow. Now, at the time, and that is the key word, at the time, I actually put Alec Baldwin at number 1. But revisiting the movie, I don't think I'd do the same now. I will say that his voice is extremely good. It's in many ways, it's the voice I hear when I'm reading the comics, at least as Lamont Cranston. My problem with him is that I like him as Lamont Cranston, which is who he is for most of the movie. When he becomes the Shadow, it feels a little off, for lack of a better way of putting it. The voice is there, the laugh is magnificent, but again, there's moments like, next time you get to be on top. That's not who the Shadow is. I'm not even entirely sure that's who Lamont Cranston is. It really does feel like that's the actor coming through. And I'm not sure if that was his fault or the director's fault or both. Again, Baldwin did put a lot of himself into it. But he was a Shadow fan, and I think you can see that he has passion for the character. I just think at times he wasn't quite sure what to do with him, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure who's to blame, and I'm not saying that makes it a bad performance. It's a very good performance, in my opinion.
Yeah, I should add it as an addendum to I didn't really answer the question. As far as actors who could have played him, at the time, I've said it before, he wound up dying at the end of the 90s of random onset aggressive cancer. Bob Peck, who played Robert Muldoon in Jurassic Park, would have been the perfect Lamont Cranston and the Shadow. But he's not a leading man, so they never would have cast him. But he was a magnificent actor. He was a magnificent Shakespearean actor, even. He was in the Ian McKellen production, the Royal Shakespeare Company production of Macbeth. And he's magnificent as Macduff in that. He would have been exceptional as the Shadow. He has the aquiline profile with the big nose and the high forehead, and he's got the whole 9 yards, the accent. He could have, he's got that big, pompous Shakespearean background. Would have been great for the Shadow, I think. In terms of the modern day, I would say someone like Tom Hiddleston, maybe John Hamm would be really good, or in terms of leading men, like Adrian Brody is another good one. People like that who have the big nose. Let's just like call a spade a spade. They need the big nose, but they can't be young boys. That's kind of I think if they made a mistake, like Alec Baldwin wasn't young, but I think Lamont Cranston is middle-aged, to be honest. I think of Lamont Cranston when I'm reading the pulps, and I think this is a man. This is not a boy. This is not a millennial. This guy does not have a man bun. This is a middle-aged gentleman. He looks like Sherlock Holmes. He's got that whole thing going on. So it would have to be someone well into their 40s, maybe even early 50s. And that to me is the Shadow, or no one else.
I really do, to go to Mr. Hatter's point, I think that Alec Baldwin's voice was really the thing that cemented him for this character, because he's got one of the best voices like ever. And the gravitas that he's able to bring to some of these things, like the classic, some of the classic Shadow lines, like what's that line about crime is a bitter fruit or something?
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit.
Yeah, that one.
Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
So hearing Baldwin's voice, like saying that your life belongs to me now, like all that stuff, like I can see why he was cast in this, even though like he never really kind of broke out as a leading actor. In terms of the modern day stuff, like what do you guys think about someone like Benedict Cumberbatch?
I was actually going to say
Sherlock Holmes.
I was actually going to say that if you were to cast the Shadow today, my ideal choice would be Benedict Cumberbatch. In terms of the time period that we're talking about, the 90s, I actually concur with Razorfist. I actually know Bob Peck. I have seen that production of Macbeth. It is my favorite production of Macbeth. And I completely agree. He would have been a magnificent Shadow. But I just don't think he was popular, at least in Hollywood, not popular enough to be cast.
Yeah.
Plus, and so that's the unfortunate thing. Again, Baldwin does a great job, but I do think Peck would have been absolutely brilliant. Today, I'd say that Cumberbatch would probably be my choice to play the Shadow. Absolutely. One thing that I do want to bring up is one thing I've wanted to see for a while since I got back into the Shadow groove, so to speak, is an animated version, either on TV or in a film. You could probably do one of those direct-to-DVD films. They recently did one of Batman versus the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, of all things, based on the comic series. They did 2 comic series of Batman and the Shadow. I would love if they did that, if only to bring the Shadow back to movies.
And the weird thing about that is, I believe Dynamite, who owns the Shadow license right now, did one for Red Sonja, correct?
I think so. I might be wrong, but I think so.
They recently did a animated Red Sonja thing, so it's possible. Clearly, they have some kind of connection to an animated studio.
Yeah, it would be kind of cool to see them do like a Netflix original in the vein of Castlevania, where it's kind of like almost an anime, very adult.
Now, if you were to
cartoon,
if you were to give the Shadow a voice in animated form, and you didn't want to use a celebrity, if you didn't want to use Cumberbatch or some other celebrity voice actor, there are 2 people who come to my mind. One is Maurice LaMarche. He was the Brain in Pinky and the Brain, Mr. Freeze in some of the Batman Arkham games. He's done a lot of stuff.
He sounds a lot like Orson Welles, too.
Yes, he does, and that's one of the reasons. And he has that coldness and that elegance that I think he could bring to the Shadow. Another one, and this is a perhaps somewhat more obscure one, I'm not sure if either of you will know him, Roger L. Jackson. Roger L. Jackson, for one thing, one voice that you'll know, but I don't think you'll understand why, is Mojo Jojo. But that's not why. He was in the American Mickey's Alice games, and he played various characters, including the Cheshire Cat. He's also Ghostface in all of the Scream movies. The voice on the phone is him in every single film. I think either him or LaMarche could make an absolutely perfect Shadow. They both have the right qualities.
I think if you were to cast an animated voice, you would need a nasally voice, bit of a transatlantic, maybe even British accent, because that's how Orson Welles played him, period.
Yeah.
That's the original Lamont Cranston version of the Shadow anyways. And someone who can cackle. And when I hear that, and then I think about what the Shadow actually is, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but really the key to the Shadow is not that he's really not the Punisher. And he's not. He's not even Batman, really. He's evil visited against evil. That's what he is. He's a good guy, a 100% binary white hat good guy, but he's sicked on bad guys and uses the tactics of bad guys: sneaking, lock picking, subversion, disguises, murder, Sometimes even elaborate, gruesome murder. You know what I mean? Like he's using pistols against bad guys. He's using Tommy guns at a time of prohibition against gangsters, right? He's the evil guy. So to me, I would go with somebody who's traditionally identified with evil voice acting. I would go with someone like Malcolm McDowell or like a Terrence Stamp. To me, that sounds in my head way more like the Shadow than like a young man who's a suave man about town. If they, especially because they're such good actors, they could do a more demure version of themselves when they're Lamont Cranston, and then they could like really ham it up for the Shadow stuff. But you'd really want like a nefarious voice, not just like a suave younger voice, you know.
Speaking of nefarious, let's talk about the main villain of the movie, Shiwan Khan.
Yay!
Part of the pulp tradition of using original characters as villains / nemesis. You had Flash Gordon, had Ming the Merciless. The Phantom has Dogai Singh. Buck Rogers had Emperor Draco, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So in the source material, Shiwan Khan is the Shadow's arch nemesis, making him the natural choice to be the main villain in the movie. However, despite the film's attempts to show how powerful and evil the character of Shiwan Khan is, to me, he never seems to be that interesting or credible of a villain. So what I want to know from you guys is, what are your thoughts on Shiwan Khan as the main antagonist of the movie? Was the character true to the source material? And how do you think he could have been made into a better villain for the movie? Razorfist, why don't we start with you?
I think it was a mistake to go with Shiwan Khan outright. I think the first movie should have been more grounded. It should have been like a really nefarious crime boss. You could have gone with someone like Diamond Burt, who by the way was kind of the prototype for the recurring villain. That's one of the great contributions the Shadow made to pulps and later to comic books, is the idea of the supervillain. You don't have the Joker if you don't have the Shadow, because Walter B. Gibson did this thing where he would, when he was writing the Shadow pulps, he would, every time he made a character, he would write him down on an index card, and then he had like different categories in his Filofax or whatever of what group they belonged to. And then he'd have, a living and a dead group. And when somebody got killed, they got put in the dead bin. And when they were still alive, he would put them in alive, because he knew he wanted to reference that, and he wanted to bring them back if possible, so that there was a sense of continuity, right? So that was one of the happy byproducts of that. In the very first Shadow pulp, there's a character named Diamond Burt, and he is not killed at the end of the story. Everybody else is brought to justice. A bunch of other people are killed, but Diamond Burt survives. And so he came back. In fact, I think he came back more than once. And that was kind of the advanced scout, the Paul Revere of the supervillain. And gradually, they started working more and more of these supervillains, these recurring supervillain characters. And the Voodoo Master was one of the big ones. And Double Z, and the Prince of Evil, and Shiwan Khan, of course. He came back 3 times, I believe, which is the same number as the Voodoo Master, actually. So there's kind of some debate over who his actual arch nemesis is. But I think it would have been smarter, especially given the budget strictures, to probably go with just a really ruthless, canny mob boss who maybe has aspirations of something greater. But, maybe he's in league with Nazis. I don't know, whatever. But, it should have been more grounded, I think. I think that was, right off the bat, that was a mistake. John Lone, however, makes the best with somewhat meager material. He's very, very good. And I also have to say, as a side note, his costumes are magnificent. Has to be said. They did a really, really good job visually on this film, period. But the costumes are super underrated. Because they were taking pulp material that was pretty outlandish and putting it on the screen, and they pulled it off magnificently, especially like his big, long, flowing robes and stuff. The character itself, I complain about this a little bit in the Shadow Green Hornet review that I did on the Shadowcast. It's the same problem I've always got. Shiwan Khan is threatening because he is a Machiavellian genius. That's really his power. His power is not to throw bolts of force lightning at people and mind control. And you know what I mean? Like, that's not what makes Shiwan Khan threatening. It's the fact that he's one of the few people who could find the Shadow's secret sanctum. He's one of the few who could put the Shadow in mortal physical peril because he's just that brilliant a tactical mind. That's what we don't really get a sense of in the movie, unfortunately. Instead we get throwing mental bolts at each other and long staring contests and stuff. That's not terribly interesting. Number one, cinematically, probably would have been a little more interesting if the ending sequence had not been cut. But even at that, I don't think it would have been thematically all that satisfying. I think they took the wrong approach with the character. Instead of fighting each other tactically and, trying to outthink each other in a great big super villain hero chess match, we get Goku and Vegeta having a Super Saiyan fight, in a Hall of Mirrors or whatever. That's basically, not working.
Mr. Hatter, what did you think of Shiwan Khan as the primary antagonist? And do you think that it was true to the source material? And how do you think he could have been utilized better?
Well, it's interesting because there was a lot of stuff that Razor just brought up. I'm going to be honest, I never thought of before. I kind of half agree and half disagree. I personally think that Shiwan Khan in this movie, actually, I really, really love the character. But there's a difference. I don't know how to put this. There is a difference between liking the character and really thinking it's true to the source material, if that makes sense. I felt that he looked extremely good. I felt that John Lone was perfect casting for that part. There are moments in the film where I felt they really did work with the relationship between the Shadow and Shiwan Khan, because maybe it's just me, but what I always loved about what I've read in the comics, because again, I have to stress, I have not read too many of the pulps, and sadly, I have not read any of the pulps with Shiwan Khan yet. That's something I hope to amend. I only really know Shiwan Khan through this movie and the comics. And in a lot of the comics I've read, there seems to be this kind of relationship that's, I don't know how to describe it. It's very Holmes and Moriarty. There's almost a respect mixed in with this absolute hatred. They are both the best at what they do. They both have a lot in common, but they are on completely different paths. And that plays a lot into Shiwan Khan's relationship with Lamont, the Shadow, Yinko, whatever you want to call him in this film. And I felt that was a really interesting angle they went with. And that was something that made the character really stand out. You felt these two did have that mirror element. But let me put it this way. In a lot of the stories I've read and a lot of pictures I've seen, you see Shiwan Khan sitting very gracefully on this wonderful throne with this beautiful cigarette holder, perfectly calm and composed, and he's able to outthink everybody. And in this film, he literally eats with his hands. No, that's not who he is. That's not who he is.
My biggest issue with Shiwan Khan, I think it was kind of endemic of comic book villains in the 90s anyway, is that, they tried their best to make him quote unquote evil by show him like, oh, I'm going to kill these random people. I'm going to make this guy jump off the Empire State Building. I'm going to assassinate, or I'm going to kill my own or threaten my own subordinates type thing. It just felt very kind of cookie cutter and cliche, what they kind of had him do. I'm going to disagree about a little bit about the costumes, not that they're not brilliantly designed, but it felt like the whole like evil Oriental thing that was so prevalent in the pulps didn't really translate all that well to modern day, in my opinion. And I get what they were trying to do in this movie, where you have like I think 3 or 4 scenes where Shiwan Khan and Lamont Cranston are literally like sitting across from each other having a chit chat, and there's a lot of subtext there where there is some tension. But if you look at Robert De Niro and Al Pacino's first on-screen meeting together in I'm drawing a blank on that crime movie now, Heat. That's what it was, where they're sitting in the diner and they're kind of facing each other and they're having a regular conversation, but you can just tell that there's a lot of gravitas to it. They try to do this in this movie, and they try to show that Shiwan Khan and Lamont Cranston are very similar in certain respects, and they try to explore that, but I feel like every time they do, they don't quite pull it off. And I would have liked to have seen, kind of like how Razorfist said, that Shiwan Khan to be little bit more tactical, a little bit more of a mental threat than someone who's kind of like, the mustache twirling villain in some cases, like literally. I think the best scene in the movie between those two is when they fire the gun at each other and they're both on such the same wavelength that the bullets hit tip to tip and just kind of fall to the floor. And they're both like, what just happened? I think that's probably the most true to life image for their relationship, where they're both firing, on the same level. And that's probably one of my most favorite moments in the film. But beyond that, I kind of felt like the antagonistic relationship between the two was a little bit mishandled. But speaking of the person who's handling it, let's talk about the director of this film, Russell Mulcahy. He was a music video director, perhaps best known for his film Highlander. And Mulcahy, one of the great things about this movie is the visual style that Mulcahy brought to it. Like, visually, at the time, this movie was very stunning. It doesn't quite hold up, nowadays, but like it still has a very distinct flair to it. And he basically kind of catered his visual style around the look of 1920s Art Deco, kind of made famous by Fritz Lang from his movie Metropolis. So what I want to ask you guys is, what do you think of the art design of the film? And do you agree with setting the film in the 1920s or 30s of the original pulp novels and radio dramas, as opposed to modernizing it as Batman did with its setting and time period? Mr. Hatter, why don't we start with you?
Well, I actually really, really love the art style of this film, and I personally think it does hold up, but maybe not for the reasons you might be thinking. Something that I feel with a lot of films nowadays for a long time is that they all kind of have a certain look that's the same, if that makes sense. And this film, it bears a certain resemblance to Batman, but it also has something of its own. And even though there's parts of it where you like, oh, that's a painting or that's a set or whatever, it looks so wonderful. I think part of that is that, and this was on the special features of the Blu-ray, which Razor mentioned earlier, and which I actually have myself, they actually did want it to look not just like the 30s, but like a film out of the 30s. So a lot of the art style is geared towards sort of looking like something that could have been done then. And I think that was a really interesting approach to go with. So I think it helps to kind of forgive some of the moments where it's like, oh, that's obviously a matte painting or whatever. Well, at least it's a good looking one. And at least the style fits the era and everything. And I do think it was a good idea to set it in that period with the shadow, because I think if you had modernized it more, it really would have completely looked with the style they were going with, like Tim Burton's Batman.
Yeah, Mr. Fist, one of the interesting things about the art design and the look and feel of this, it kind of reminded me a lot of Dick Tracy, with kind of how they translated that pulp to the big screen. What do you think of Mr. Mulcahy's art direction and the look of the film?
The unsung hero of the movie isn't even the director. It's Stephen H. Burham, who does Burham, whatever, the cinematographer, who does not get enough credit. And this is, folk, people think they just like slap this thing on the screen. This is the guy who shot The Untouchables, and the War of the Roses. Like this guy is a serious cinematographer, and he did some of his best work on this movie, and that's not an exaggeration. He did a really, really, really good job, especially with lighting.
Yeah.
That whole sequence with the shadow, with Lamont Cranston and the police commissioner, not police commissioner Weston, but the other one, the hump. Who in the pulps is actually a hump. That's actually a 100% accurate portrayal of the character. But him and Margo Lane, of course, where he steps back into that shadow bar and whatnot, and like that, the stuff going on in that scene is like vintage Stephen Burham, really. Like that's him. But as far as the direction itself, I mean, I don't see it as being any lesser because he was a music video director. The truth is, if this movie was made in 2019, it'd probably be made by a much worse music video director. Len Wiseman is a music video director. Like everybody's a music video director now and jumps into films and often doesn't bring much more than a music video to the proceedings. There's a lot more here than a music video. It's a gorgeous movie. I patently disagree that it doesn't hold up. Matte paintings always look better than CGI, and this has some really good matte paintings in it, actually.
Agreed.
Like almost Blade Runner-ish kind of quality matte paintings. That's one of the reasons I love Blade Runner. It's one of the last like truly analog effects films. What really doesn't hold up here is the CGI. And not all of it. Some of it actually looks very good, but and surprisingly good considering how many years have elapsed since. But I think Hollywood directors at this time were a little more economical and understood like what they could sort of get away with regard to CGI, especially without a huge budget. It's kind of like Steven Spielberg and Jurassic Park. Why does the first Jurassic Park look better than Fallen Kingdom? Because Steven Spielberg was more cognizant of, okay, here's how far I can go to the uncanny valley without jumping off the edge. You know what I mean? So I think the film makes some wise calls with regard to that. But yeah, Stephen Burham's probably the real hero here. The cinematography is just exceptional.
Yeah, and one of the great things about how this movie was shot is how they utilize lighting, especially when the Shadow was using his hypnosis and mind tricks and stuff like that. So going along with that, one of the more interesting aspects of this movie is that Mulcahy tried to incorporate various kind of film noir elements into it, particularly in how he chose to utilize lighting effects like that. And if we look at the typical elements of film noir, there's stuff like an anti-hero protagonist, a femme fatale, taut, very terse dialogue, high contrast lighting. And film noirs also tend to have very dark endings in the sense that the antagonist or the protagonist suffers some type of tragic fate. It's like a tragedy, basically. So what I want to ask you guys is, how well do you think The Shadow fits into the style of film noir? And was this genre successfully blended with the superhero genre in this movie, in your opinion? And how well did Mulcahy succeed in combining these kind of different aspects of filmmaking? Razor, let's start with you.
But yeah, well, as you know, I do a whole series. I don't know if you know, I do an entire series on film noir called The Film Noir Archives. I've never felt The Shadow as a film noir at all. It certainly has strong mystery and atmospheric and even expressionist elements, at least when I see the pulps in my head as I'm reading them, you know what I mean? But there's nothing in the text. Like Walter B. Gibson, one of his favorite writers was Raymond Chandler, but you could not detect the faintest hint of Raymond Chandler in that, right? I've always said, like, one of the big things that defines film noir is not so much the darkness. It's not so much the downbeat quality. Some of the worst film noir are the ones that are the most depressing, right? Like Night in the City, gorgeous movie, absolute dreck as a film, just total absolute waste of film. But what really defines film noir, strangely enough, is not so much the darkness, it's the levity and the comedy. There's a bit of that here. It's just not, it's kind of dumb comedy. It's not like wisecracking Sam Spade type stuff. You know what I mean? It's definitely not Philip Marlowe caliber. So in that sense, there's a little bit of it, but it's really not much of a mystery. So it's hard to feel that it's any kind of a film noir. Really, the only references to film noir are visual. And which is very familiar nowadays. Unfortunately, modern films are much less interested in being a film noir than raping and pillaging film noir for things they think look neat. You know what I mean? And The Shadow's, unfortunately, one of those movies. It's, hey, that looks like a neat shot. That's cool lighting effects. Those are cool. And that's for the best in this case, because this is 1994, man. We can't get away with just shooting some chick in a nice dress on a green screen. We have to, although they did actually do that for Margo Lane at one point in this movie. But, we can't do that in every single shot. We can't do Attack of the Clones. We're not George Lucas. We can't get away with it. CGI is not there yet. So everything pretty much has to be analog with the exception of one or two effect shots. So it's wise to go with film noir because, as I've said many a time, film noir is really not this like pretentious, massive extravagant medium. It's really like an economical medium. The reason they dimly lit all of these sets is because the sets look like crap. Like all the real stars were over making propaganda films for the war effort, or they were actually fighting in the Pacific Theater in some cases. Sometimes they were invading mainland Germany, whatever. So the people who were left over were short people like Alan Ladd, people like Humphrey Bogart, and the sets and the budgets for these movies were very similar. The directors were the same. All the directors were making propaganda films. So it was second string guys with second string budgets. So we use dim lighting to hide drab sets. We use steam and fog and rain to camouflage that we frankly do not have that much of a budget. So this movie, it's actually a wise choice because it's not that expensive of a movie. And it's smart to do that. A really good example of that is the very opening sequence, which I think is probably the best sequence of the movie, unfortunately, which is really similar to the opening of The Living Shadow pulp, where the shadow attacks the gangsters. And there's even a few references to some of the gangsters being pulp characters. And then you finally see the shadow. And they're very wise because this is clearly on a soundstage. There's like a backdrop that's like clearly a matte painting in the background and like whatever. But they light it in such a way, they put enough fog there, it's dark enough that it doesn't call attention to it, and it calls attention to the shadow instead. Really, really smart choice. That's kind of how film noir informed this production, I think.
Mr. Hatter, what do you think? Did they blend these kind of elements of film noir with the superhero genre successfully?
I actually basically 100% agree with Razor in this case. I think it is superficially a film noir. It has the look of a film noir, and it uses that to its advantage. But in terms of the meat of it, the actual story and characters and what's under the surface, I think it's more superhero than anything else. There's not a great mystery to solve. The comedy is there, but it's not the same kind of comedy. And the darkness is there too, but it's not even the same kind of darkness. I think it's more that it uses the style rather than the substance, which is fine. And I think it works. And again, the whole thing looks gorgeous, so I can't complain. It is amazing to look at. But I do think that is basically the summation. It looks like a film noir. It feels like a superhero.
I'm sure we'll talk about the ending sequence that was cut, but there was supposed to be a massive callback to the Orson Welles film noir, The Lady from Shanghai, at the end of the film. I mean, literally like a shot for shot. And it was supposed to be like almost a one-to-one layover. Shiwan Khan replaced with with Rita Hayworth, I guess. I don't know what the hell. And the shadow is supposed to be Orson Welles, but obviously that didn't wind up happening. We'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But
yeah. So right now, what I want to talk about is the screenwriter of the movie, David Koepp. And his career basically seemed to blow up in the 90s. He was credited with writing some of the most majorly successful films of the decade. Films like Jurassic Park 1 and 2, Mission Impossible, Carlito's Way, Panic Room, and of course, Spider-Man in the 2000s. He was also involved in some not so successful films such as Death Becomes Her, The Paper, The Trigger Effect, Snake Eyes, and probably most notoriously, at least for me, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So Koepp was mentored by people like Steven Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis, and he wrote the screenplay for The Shadow during his initial upward swing in his career. And though I think that the film is quite well structured, its dialogue, its characterization, and its plot points seem quite inconsistent throughout the story to me. So what I want to know from you guys is, what did you think of Koepp's script? Do you believe that he was able to remain faithful to the source material? And what do you think of him as a writer overall? Mr. Hatter, what are your thoughts?
This is actually a hard question for me to answer. My feeling about David Koepp is that he is an imperfect writer, not a bad one. I think he is a good writer, but he's an imperfect writer. Even if you look at some of his most successful films like Jurassic Park or Spider-Man, you'll find some flaws in there. And I think it depends a lot on how well you're able to cover up those flaws and make a connection with the audience. I also think it depends a lot on who's acting in it, the directors, and so forth. It depends on a lot of things. And of course, nothing is ever perfect, so I don't think we can really fault him for that. It depends on the emotional connection. With this film, I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying about Baldwin earlier, and how sometimes it felt right on the money, and other times it was like you just didn't quite understand what was going on there, and it felt like it was more about the actor than anything else. Right. I think that in this case, Kep clearly had a lot of passion. He liked the Shadow. He wanted to do this idea of how does he know what the evil that's in the hearts of men, and I think that was a good direction to go with. But I don't really know. It doesn't always feel consistent, like you said. There are certain plot points that don't always add up, and there's inconsistencies with the tone, as we've discussed before. And I'm not sure how much of that inconsistency was him and how much of it was the actors, but it is present. I think he did care for the source material. He apparently had wanted to write it for a long, long time. So, and he does borrow a lot of elements from the radio show, from earlier versions like the Columbia serial, from the pulps and the comics. So he clearly did his homework. I think it's just maybe in kind of the jumble of things and adding his own stuff, things got a little mixed up. It's hard for me to describe.
No, I completely concur. It seems to me like really it's not so much Kep being that imperfect of a writer as much as he's trying to write. It's like he's trying to write the pulp version of the Shadow in a radio Shadow story.
Excellent way.
Kind of how it comes across. Because you've got the Shadow, he's in his full regalia, he's got the scarf, he's got the cloak. I mean, it's the whole 9 yards. In fact, at one point they were supposed to have like a CGI cloak for the Shadow, like Spawn, like the Spawn movie.
Oh Lord.
It was supposed to be like that, and apparently at some point they were just like, that's not going to happen. You can actually see a sneak peek of it, by the way, in the music video for Original Sin by Taylor Dane. That version that was from early enough in the production, I guess, where they still had the CGI cape flapping around. But they were trying to do the pulp version and maybe mixed with the comic version a little bit. But if it does feel like the story is tailored more toward, the more levity laden, maybe like Bill Johnstone version of the Radio Shadow. Nothing wrong with that. From what I understand, David Kep was drawn to the Shadow through the radio show, which might be the culprit here, honestly. In fact, there is an explicit callback to an episode of The Shadow where Margo Lane is hypnotized and attempts to kill the Shadow, right? They literally copy that plot point and put it in here. And that's actually a slightly later Shadow episode, if I remember correctly. I can't remember the exact title. I have a copy of the script, but that exact episode, I think, is a little bit later. I think it is still an Orson Welles episode, but it's a little bit later in the series. So it's like this guy listened to a lot of Shadow radio shows. Like he wasn't just listening to the first couple. So clearly he's got a passion for the character, but I do think it's in the amalgamation process that it kind of loses its way a little bit. Nothing wrong with David Kep as a writer, though. In fact, he's written and directed a number of movies that I like.
Same here, actually.
It's kind of funny because when I was younger, I was very big on David Kep. And when I got into film school, it was during my time in film school when he kind of broke out into directing. And there was that Kevin Bacon film he did, something, I forget the name of it. It's like something about echoes or something like that. And then he also did The Trigger Effect, which was a movie that I was really excited to see at the time. And over time, looking at his body of work, I've kind of come to the conclusion that J.J. Hatter's correct. He's a very imperfect writer. He tends to lean more imperfect than good most of the time, in my opinion. So I do feel like he's a competent writer, but a lot of his shortcomings were kind of obvious in this movie. And I think a lot of that stuff, not to fault him, kind of boiled down to the budget and the director as well, certain choices that were made during the production of it. But one of the most common criticisms of this movie is that though the Shadow is the protagonist of the film, it seems like the character is very rarely on the screen. Yeah. And when he is, he doesn't seem to be very effective as a hero, you know. Other than the opening scene on the bridge of New York City, which Razorfist talked about earlier, the Shadow seems to lose most of his fights in the film, most notoriously. You know, he simply just runs away from Khan's men after letting them kidnap Margot's father at the midpoint of the film. However, having the hero always winning throughout the movie can undercut, the climax of the story by robbing it of its tension. So if a hero is to fail in a story, it's usually best practice as a storyteller to have the hero fail despite his or her best efforts. So what I want to ask you guys is, what do you think could have been done to enhance the obstacles the Shadow faced in this story? How could the story have allowed him to, quote unquote, fail, but in a way that wasn't detrimental to the audience's perception of the character, like making him look stupid or incompetent or what have you?
Yeah.
So, Razorfist, what do you think?
That speaks to me of the flaws in the Shiwan Khan characterization. Because in a Walter B. Gibson story, that would have been where Walter B. Gibson pulls out, a plot device of some kind that Shiwan Khan had divined. And usually, because Gibson was such a good writer, there would be some kind of hint to it earlier in the story that the reader missed. And, it would only come into full flower at that point, him planning an ambush that the Shadow couldn't have foreseen because he wasn't aware that Shiwan Khan possessed that ability. You understand? That kind of is what Shiwan Khan is missing, and it would have given the Shadow license to fail a couple of times. Would have made Shiwan Khan a bigger menace as well, which I don't... Again, I think maybe the problem here is, like I said, David Koepp, big fan of the radio show. I don't know how many pulp novels he read. I don't know how familiar he actually was with Shiwan Khan. Maybe that's the problem here. Because if he had read those pulps, I think he would have seen like the version of the character that really needs to be on the screen, which is this puppet master, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hatter, what do you think about that? I know one of your big criticisms seemed to be that there wasn't enough of the Shadow on the screen, and when he was on the screen, he didn't really seem to succeed all that much. So.
Well, actually, you're not quite right. My problem was not that the Shadow didn't succeed that much, though that is an issue. And I actually 100% agree with Razor. I think part of that was Shiwan Khan. Again, I do like Shiwan Khan in this movie, but he didn't feel like the tactical mastermind and genius that we really got from a lot of other versions. He felt a little more straightforward and a bit more like, I guess, like a Sith Lord or something. But what I think was really problematic for me with the Shadow not being around, that didn't bother me. Because maybe it's just me, and if either of you want to correct me, feel free. It felt to me, listening to a lot of the radio shows, and even looking at the 40s Columbia serial with Victor Jory, which I absolutely adore, it always felt like the Shadow would pop out when he needed to pop out. Now, that's not necessarily the case in the comics and the pulps, but it felt that way with the radio show and the serial, and we know that Koepp was very familiar with the radio show. But what bothered me was that in the radio show, in the pulps, in the comics, the Shadow was this very verbose character. He relishes the chance to sort of taunt his enemies and to deliver these grand, eloquent speeches. And instead, aside from that first scene on the bridge, where we don't even see him for most of that, when he's talking, he instead is a very silent character. He doesn't talk much as the Shadow. And I really wish we could have gotten more of that element of the character. And I think if you had managed it well and mixed that with Shiwan Khan being something more of a puppet master who knew things the Shadow didn't and could use that against him, I think it would have created a much more powerful dynamic there and would have created for a much more competent hero and a much more powerful character.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
What I want to talk about...
It goes back to my original point, by the way, with the agents. If you need the human element, the agents should have been more active. The agents could have been the one who dropped the ball. The Shadow wouldn't have had to get boo-boo faced, which is really the problem there. The Shadow has the failure because the agents are so passive. If you had Harry Vincent in that situation and he gives Harry Vincent explicit instructions and provides for eventualities, like this is normally how the pulps work. it's Harry Vincent or it's Hawkeye or somebody who finds themselves in trouble because they're just a lowly underling. Like they were given orders, but they're not the Shadow. And then the Shadow has to swoop in and save the day. And we move the plot forward, but the Shadow doesn't have to look bad.
That's a good way of dealing with it. So we've talked about the characters. Let's talk about what I consider to be the central theme of this movie, and to a greater extent, the character of the Shadow himself, at least the movie version. It's really about struggling against one's darker nature and what it really means to be good. At its heart, the story of the Shadow seems to want to be that of a redemption arc, as opposed to the character of Batman, which is more of a revenge arc. Showing Lamont Cranston starting off as being an evil man and then him attempting to atone for his past deeds by fighting crime as the Shadow. However, this internal struggle is never really explored to its fullest extent in the movie, and there is only one real scene in the film where we get a sense of Cranston's tortured psyche about the man he used to be, which is the scene where Margo enters into his fever dream after he got shot. In the film, in fact, the movie actually kind of bypasses a large segment of the character's arc by opting not to show Cranston's training in the monastery in favor of simply telling the audience what happened with a scrolling text card, which is something I don't think I've ever seen done in any other movie. Like, it was really a bizarre choice to do it that way, in my opinion. So what I want to ask you guys is, how do you think this redemption theme could have been better explored? And what could have been done to strengthen Cranston's character arc in the movie? Mr. Hatter, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, with the text card, I personally think that was actually an artistic choice, because I've mentioned it several times, the 40 serial, which starred Victor Jory, and almost every serial worth of note, including that one, they would open with this text card, sort of, for those who came in late, describing what had happened up to that point. With that said, I do think it glances over that part of his story, but from what I understand, the film had to be cut down a lot by the time it was released. So I don't know if there were ever plans to go further into his backstory and what made him the way he was and detail that more, but I think it would have made the film a lot longer. The best way I think you could have managed that, so that we could have seen more of his transformation and seen more of the Tulku and maybe seen more of what made him connect to Shiwan Khan, was maybe flashbacks. Simple and kind of cliched idea, I know, but if we had seen, maybe instead of a fever dream of him slashing people to pieces, maybe a scene of him, I don't know, training or something. Maybe we could have gotten that a little more. But I don't really know how you could have done it. I also think that not showing everything makes the character a little more mysterious. But it's up to the audience to decide if that's to a fault, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Mr. Fist. So I think my biggest problem with the opening of this movie is that they have this kind of prelude to the main action that the title card then kind of like fast forwards to modern day. And it just feels like the flow of the movie, and we go back to the pacing issue. Yeah, it gets ruined by this. And Mr. Hatter's suggestions of incorporating flashbacks throughout the movie, I think, might have been a little bit better of a choice. But what do you think about the character arc and the themes and stuff like that we've talked about?
Yeah, I think it was a fantastic movie in 2004 as Batman Begins. But
fair enough.
Here's the thing: if you're gonna do the origin story, do the origin story. It feels like they're half pregnant. It's kind of my issue. If you're going to do the origin story, do it. I think it's terrible. It's a terrible idea. I don't think you should do an origin story for the Shadow. It fundamentally perverts the very idea of the character. But if you're going to do it, don't stop halfway. You understand? And that's kind of the problem. They just continue to, hey, we're going to have an origin story, but halfway through it, here's some text. Here's something to read. And then we just see the Shadow fully formed. And for all we know, this is the first time he's ever fought crime. But of course, later on, that gets murky, because then we don't understand, because there's a bunch of agents. Like, where did they come from? Has this been going on for years now? And then he has a conversation with the police chief, and the police chief is kind of like, not really. There's a Shadow going on. There's a whole lot of rumors about this Shadow guy. So again, there's kind of you never really get a sense of how long he's been fighting crime. I think you should have taken one approach or the other. They tried to take both. You should have either jumped right in where he's the shadow and then, like he suggested, flash back perhaps to how this started. I understand the need to make Shiwan Khan a personal threat, but you'd be surprised how late in the game you actually have to divulge origin. You know what I mean? Like, you could have kept that mysterious. Why is he so obsessed with Shiwan Khan? Why does he feel personally drawn to it? Instead of telling the story through exhaustive scenes that depict his training or the stupid nonsense with the CGI dagger or whatever, instead of having all of that, you could have cut that out entirely, jumped right into the movie where you're following the Pulp Avenger. And then when he first encounters Shiwan Khan, his face blanches, and suddenly this supernatural Pulp Avenger who's been, gunning down all these mobsters, suddenly he's been cut to his core by something, and the audience wonders what it is. Instead of, and now the audience is finishing your thought. Now you're stringing the audience along instead of spoon feeding them a bunch of contrived nonsense that you've already seen in a bunch of other superhero movies. But not the approach they took, I guess. You could have divulged slowly over the course of the film, okay, he knows him because of this. Okay, he knows him because of that. Oh, okay, they're like rivals. And now, by the time they're sitting in a booth together or whatever at a Chinese restaurant of all places, and they shoot the bullets at each other and they, smack the ground or whatever, when that actually happens, there's more impact because it's fresher in your mind just how fiery their rivalry actually is. That would have been my approach, just jump right into the movies. Don't waste people's time.
I think Universal needs to give you some money to make a movie, Mr. Fist.
I agree.
So, we've talked about the villain. Let's talk about the main love interest in this movie, which is the character of Margo Lane, portrayed by Penelope Ann Miller. So Margo was originally created for the Shadow radio drama to provide a vocal contrast to all the male casts, and was initially kind of met with scorn from the Shadow fan base. But over time, she became more of a staple in the Shadow's character gallery, acquiring psychic powers of her own, which allowed her to be immune to the Shadow's abilities and the only one to know his true identity. This character plays a central role in the film, with the Shadow going so far as to rely on her to save his life at the end of the second act. But their romance is never really believable, at least to me, and the chemistry between Baldwin and Miller, which you guys talked about earlier, to me, it felt very forced throughout much of the movie. There were times where it worked, but for the most part, I didn't think it did. So what I want to ask you guys is, what do you think could have been done to make this romance much more believable in the film? And how well do you think it was executed in regards to the film noir, femme fatale sensibility that the film tried to capture? Razorfist?
Well, there is no femme fatale. I mean, really, in terms of film noir archetype, she's a little more like a chanteuse or something like that, or even like an outright ingenue. But it kind of, I think the real problem is maybe it's cuts, but when you really think about it, by the time they're having anything resembling a romance, they have had a grand total of 2 scenes together. And they're not the longest scenes. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like they've really gotten to know each other. And this movie is very economical with dialogue too. So even in those scenes, it's not like they're having these lengthy exchanges or anything. You don't get this sense that like sparks are flying and they've got to know more about each other. I really like the exchange where he tries to shadow her, to cloud her mind, and it doesn't work. Like, I like that sequence. I think that's cool. It's the closest you get to where it's like, okay, now I understand like why he would be interested at all. That I get. But there should have been more stuff like that instead of, just snarky back and forth. And like I said, there's probably 2 scenes maybe they were together. And then you get the sense that they keep trying to wedge her into scenes where she probably doesn't even need to be, like where she opens the big death trap tank and saves him at the 11th hour. Like, that could have been anyone. He's got a whole group of agents for that, for crying out loud. The whole thing, I think, because they don't give them enough stuff early on, and the stuff that they're given isn't terribly meaningful, then they have to like fumble for ways to put them together. But I disagree. I think they absolutely have chemistry against the best efforts of the script. They actually they do have some chemistry despite the movie.
Well, let me ask you this real quick before I go to JJ. Why was Shiwan Khan able to hypnotize Margo, but Lamont Cranston couldn't?
Exactly. They're supposed to be equal. I guess it's to create a deepening thread of Shiwan Khan's psychic abilities or something. Maybe that's the thought is, hey, if we do this, then it seems like Shiwan Khan is 1,000 times more powerful than the Shadow. But the problem, of course, is the script doesn't play that up. And so it comes across less like that and more like a plot device. Honestly, at that point, you probably should have just cut out the psychic crap with Margo Lane. If you were going to go that route later on, you probably just should have taken away that, because that's not in the pulps at all. And it's not in most of the comics, except the ones that are inspired by the Baldwin movie. So, you could easily remove that, or if you're going to do it, then at least apply it properly. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, the Shadow winds up dehypnotizing her. So I guess that makes them equal on some level, but it's very clunky. I agree.
Yeah,
makes no sense.
JJ, what did you think of this romance and the chemistry between Baldwin and Miller?
Well, first of all, I agree with the fact I do think they have great chemistry. I think the two bounce off one another absolutely brilliantly. It really is the narrative. It really is the script. And I actually didn't think of that until a couple watchings, because the first time I watched it, I absolutely loved their romance and I thought it was great. I think it was around the second or third time I rewatched the film that I go, yeah, they had one, maybe two scenes, one of them being where she tried to kill him. I don't quite get it, but I think that the two managed to pull it off despite the script. Now, I will say that I actually do like the psychic element with Margo, because I think that's a really cool element to her character. But I don't think they do enough with it, and it doesn't always make sense. Again, why was he able to hypnotize her? How did that work? If they're supposed to be equals, what's going on there?
Yeah.
And so I think if they had just utilized that in a better way, it would have made it so much more powerful.
Yeah, I think probably the strongest scene in the whole movie between the two of them is where she spends the night and he goes into her room to kind of enlist her help, and she's being very sassy, and she goes and she changes outfits and stuff like that, and they're back and forth in that scene. I felt was kind of like the part where you guys are saying their chemistry worked, whereas leading up to that, I didn't feel any of that going on at all. But speaking of romances, let's talk about the strange bromance between Shiwan Khan and Lamont Cranston in the film. So for some reason, Shiwan Khan, he seems obsessed with the main character of Lamont Cranston, and he keeps attempting to win him over to his side rather than simply eliminate him as a threat right off the bat. And this feels quite contrived to me, as Khan does not seem interested in sharing power, as evidenced by his conversation with Tim Curry's character Claymore. So the story seems to try to draw parallels between Khan and Cranston by showing that they are inherently similar people on different sides, much kind of like how Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty are with their rivalry. However, at no point does it seem as though Cranston is tempted to join Khan or revert back to his old violent, evil ways. There's no kind of internal struggle with that temptation there. So what do you think could have been done differently to not only show this similarity between the characters, but to also deepen Cranston's internal struggle in dealing with his darker nature as brought to the surface by Shiwan Khan? Razorfist?
Probably the best way, and I don't know why they didn't do it, is the only way that he could defeat Shiwan Khan is to become darker than Shiwan Khan. That, to me, that's the only way it makes sense for him to even be remotely tempted. And they don't even go there, which is bizarre. Instead, they have a thought fight, which is, I do not understand that at all. I completely agree. The temptation aspect doesn't work at all, which is unfortunate, because the sequence in which he tries to tempt Lamont Cranston is one of the coolest in the movie, where he just shows up in the Shadow's sanctum, which is a big deal.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a big deal, and a big statement. It's probably the moment where he feels the most threatening, and all he does is walk into a room. You know what I mean? That's the Shiwan Khan of the pulps right there. That's what he would do. He would just walk into the room and say, I own your private life now. I don't have to have Mongol warriors trying to chop your head off to demonstrate that I own you. You know what I mean? So, I agree. I think the smartest way to go about that, or at least the way that I would be, okay, you can defeat Shiwan Khan, but you have to become 10 times more evil than Shiwan Khan. And that's something that I could see tempting the Shadow because he's such a pragmatist. Because this is a character who is... Probably you would have to enhance the violence at the beginning of the movie to make it seem like the Shadow is, incredibly cruel against crime, and maybe have someone question him and say, once you cross the line, you're evil and it doesn't matter. Because it's kind of an objectivist hero, right? The black is black, white is white, and that's his worldview, right? That's the Shadow. It's always been him. So you'd have to kind of make a compelling enough argument where it almost makes sense for the Shadow to go there just to stop the wider threat and save the city, right? That kind of is the only way that makes sense.
Mr. Hatter, what did you think of this strange bromance, and how do you think it could have played out better?
I actually mostly disagree completely. Well, not completely, but mostly. I felt the reason is because I didn't think the temptation was the point from what I was getting from the film. And I don't know if I made this clear, but I actually rewatched the film earlier this week for the purpose of this podcast so that I could kind of get it with a fresh look. I didn't really get a sense of temptation. I got more a sense of shame. He sees Khan and he sees who he used to be, and that scares him. It's not that he's tempted to be that way again. It's that he's horrified that he was ever that way, and he's horrified someone could be just as bad or worse. And it kind of goes, you mentioned Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty. Holmes was never tempted by Moriarty, not often anyway. It's always been a battle of, I am justice, I am good, I am evil, and I am crime. And they both have similarities, they both have things that are different as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I never felt it was a matter of temptation, so that was never something I worried about. Now, again, the great weakness with Khan, I think, is that he isn't Moriarty in this version. There is a little bit of a puppet mastery vibe to him, and he does have certain elements, but he wasn't the tactical genius. He wasn't the mastermind we all knew. And I think what should have happened was, instead of a thought fight, as Razor so aptly put it, we should have had the Shadow have to outthink Khan. Not in the sense of out-psychic him, but in the sense of, I have to plan something that even he won't be able to detect. I have to outplan Shiwan Khan. I have to outwit him.
Right.
That is how I think it could have been made better.
A good example of that, the pulps always have these kind of devices. The Shadow's always thinking of he's always finding a way to hoist the enemy by their own petard. It's not enough to just kill them. There's very few enemies. Like, this is one of the reasons I don't care for the Dynamite comic very much, is the Shadow just runs out and shoots down people. Yeah, does the Shadow shoot people? Yeah, but it's usually underlings, you know what I mean? If he's going to take down a supervillain or any kind of villain, the Shadow's going to engineer some horrifically sadistic, symbolic, this kind of symbolic leveling of the scales of justice. Like, that's the apotheosis of the Shadow. And like, in the case of Shiwan Khan, if he keeps using Mongol warriors against him, okay, well, the Shadow's got a bunch of agents. The Shadow finds a way to replace all the Mongol warriors with Shadow agents in the armor because you can't see their freaking faces. So, they suddenly level swords at Shiwan Khan and he's totally screwed. You know what I mean? Like, that would be like a Shadow punishment. But unfortunately, nothing like that happens. It's, they're thinking really hard at each other.
Yeah, I think my biggest issue with the antagonist in this movie is that he seems all over the place. So like Razor said, him showing up in the inner sanctum of Cranston's was a big deal. It didn't feel that big of a deal in the movie, especially if you don't, if you don't have a lot of background with the character. But the fact that, Shiwan Khan isn't trying to kill him right away, that he's trying to recruit him and work with him, that seems to contrast with his motivations entirely. So that's one of the reasons why I disagree with JJ over this is the sense that it is about that because the writers chose to have the antagonist make it about that. You know what I mean?
I guess that's a way of putting it. But one other thing that did remind me, I almost forgot to mention. You mentioned how Shiwan Khan was not interested in sharing power. He actually says at one point, if I recall correctly, words to the effect of, "You are the only person I would be willing to share power with." And I guess there is that element of temptation, but again, I don't think that's what the hero goes through. It's what the villain goes through. He's trying to tempt the hero, but that's not the hero's journey. The hero's journey is not a journey of temptation, really, in my opinion. Not in this case. In other cases, in other stories of the hero's journey. But for this character, for this movie, that's not really what I got. I guess I can see it, though, because Khan does make that an issue. You're the only one I would be willing to share power with, as opposed to Tim Curry. Why I'm not willing to share power with him, I have no idea. So there you go.
All right. So one of my biggest issues with the film is that Lamont Cranston / aka the Shadow is very passive in driving the action forward. As a storyteller, you always want to have your main character be the catalyst, the active participant driving the plot. But he's kidnapped and forced into the service of the monks. Shiwan Khan literally hands him the primary clue as to what his master plan is. And Margo tells him exactly where to find the beryllium sphere. It's just like, he's passive in the sense that all these characters are just giving him things and doing stuff to him that, is required to make the story move forward. The only thing the Shadow seems to do on his own is figure out the actual location of Khan's hideout. But beyond that, all the plot elements seem to be handed to the character without him having to, earn them within the context of the story. So what I would like to ask you guys is, what do you think could have been done to make Cranston, aka the Shadow, a more active figure driving the plot of the movie forward? Mr. Hatter, why don't we start with you?
Well, for a start, not have him hand his clue over. What I would have done was, just for a start, this would have been the biggest thing for me. Instead of Khan handing him the coin for the bourbon, I would have had it either be accidental or seem accidental. That he finds something Shiwan Khan left behind, or they have a struggle and he tears something off Shiwan Khan. And because the Shadow was also a detective and he had agents who could help him with that. I think what was needed was to see that detective work at work. See him actually actively try to solve the case, like, where did this come from? Where does this lead? What can it mean? As opposed to, here's a coin. Go find out what the coin means. Okay, what does the coin mean? It means this. Okay, let me go ask someone else. I think if we had been able to give him that sense of his mind being able to put things together with little to no help, it would have helped. So if he had simply found the coin or taken it away or something, and then been able to go and check it out, as opposed to literally being handed it, that would have been one way you could have just started. And it could have gone on like that through the movie, actually piecing the puzzles together instead of having the puzzle pieces given to him.
Razorfist, what do you think could have been done to make the character of the Shadow a little bit more active in his own story?
I mean, you could have shown more of his abilities. They get all into this clouding men's minds, being invisible BS, but the truth is the Shadow doesn't need to turn invisible half the time because he's such a master of disguise. You referenced the coin thing. That immediately makes me think of several Shadow stories where the Shadow, the coin is actually a recurrent element. The coin is at one point used as like a token for admittance into like a criminal ring or whatever that's being used by a Chinese tong in New York City in a story called The Chinese Discs. The Shadow uncovers that himself through subterfuge and disguise. These are things you could have shown in the movie and they would have been cool, right? Instead of Alec Baldwin pulling his face off, the Shadow could have literally pulled. You could have pulled the face off, and it could have been Alec Baldwin, and you literally could have had the Mission Impossible thing going on, which, by the way, David Koepp also wrote. But it could have been. It could have literally been that. You just show more things that the Shadow is able to do. That's a really good example. Because what is that if not just a plot device? We'll let the Shadow uncover that plot device instead.
Agreed.
Yeah, like it really does seem like they made it a little bit too easy for him in this story. And one of the more interesting aspects of the Shadow story is that there is a central mystery in the second act of the film regarding what Shiwan Khan's plan is that he has to unravel. And again, this goes back to like the Dark Knight detective type thing that Batman ripped off. And in keeping with the film noir tradition of the hard-boiled detective story, we actually get to kind of see Cranston do some detective work in the film, albeit, little bit too little in my opinion. But another fascinating aspect of the Shadow is that it's also got some spy elements in it with, the Shadow traversing places unseen, and he cultivates a network of agents to help him fight against crime. How do you think the mystery and spy aspects of the film were handled, and how could they have been done differently or more effectively, in your opinion? Razor, I know that you have a lot of thoughts about this, so why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I just think the agents weren't utilized well at all. They kind of were just a call back to the pulps. It's like David Koepp wrote the script having only heard the radio plays, and then maybe he read the pulps after the fact, or some of the pulps, and tried to lay in some of those elements as well. Laid in, I mean, he would have put Shrevey in anyways because he's in the radio show. But I think that's where you get Burbank. That's where you get the other agents and stuff, and the Rings and Roy Tam and all that stuff. I think that's kind of what happened there. So they needed to be more active. Honestly, I don't see why Roy Tam's in the movie at all. That whole sequence is basically ripped off from The Living Shadow, and the character who's in that sequence is Harry Vincent, and he's not being attacked. He's about to commit suicide, which is way more interesting as an opening, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, it's cool to see the Shadow whip out his guns and shoot some concrete. He doesn't even shoot anyone. But, I mean, all that's pretty cool, but it's just as cool to have the Shadow come barreling out of the mist and stop this guy from killing himself and then say, hey, your life belongs to me now. Now you're one of my agents. Go watch this guy in this hotel. You're going to check in with me at X o'clock or whatever. And from that point, you're following Harry Vincent instead of the Shadow. And, instead of having Roy Tam, who's basically just, hey, I'm going to look into this coin for you. Hey, thanks. We'll never talk again. You know what I mean? Like, here's what the coin's made out of. So long. I never need you again. It just kind of doesn't work. But, all that goes back into the problem of the Shadow remaining a mystery instead of being like the central. Look, they tried to give him the Batman treatment. We have to. I mean, for Christ's sake, do we have to watch the string of Batman's mom's pearls hit the ground one more time? I think we get it. They're dead. They died in an alley. You know what I mean? We don't need to know everything. Once we understand the basics, we're pretty much good. They just explain too much about the Shadow, period. If you make the Shadow's agents more upfront, it really dispels that malady very well.
JJ, what did you think of the mystery and spy elements of the movie?
Well, it kind of goes back to what we were just saying, what we were saying earlier, that how could the Shadow have had more agency, so to speak? Agency, didn't intend that. But I think it would have worked if we had just seen, whether it was him or the agents, if we had seen somebody, put on a disguise, use a magnifying glass, instead of going to Roy Tam, why couldn't he have done it himself? Or if we were going to use an agent, why not have Harry Vincent go to Roy Tam, and maybe Roy Tam could have been introduced earlier in some other way.
Or if you want Margo Lane to be super active, it could have been her. Exactly. It doesn't matter. You don't even have to write Harry Vincent in, but it could be anybody. Heck, Ian McKellen is a scientist.
Yeah, have her go to her father.
Right.
Have her go to her father and say, Dad, I found this coin. Could you tell me something about it? Well, all right, Margo. Beyond my terrible American accent, I'll try to help you. You could have tried something like that to show there was a mystery to be solved. And this one, there's not much of a mystery because all the pieces are handed to us and to the Shadow.
The disgruntled Japanese gentleman from Seinfeld tells him to take his bag of oranges and leave.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I want to talk about one of the scenes that bothered me the most about this movie, and
oh no,
it's one of the worst scenes in the film, and it's also probably one of the best examples of very poor writing in this movie. and that is the scene inside the water tank where the Shadow confronts Tim Curry's character Claymore. And I just feel like it's the most forced scene in the entire film. Like, it's a bad set piece, but beyond that, the Shadow just seems out of character because he basically locks himself inside this metal death trap with his prey as the room is filling with water. And he does this in broad daylight as opposed to waiting until night and tracking Tim Curry's character to a more advantageous location, like something that any rational angel of vengeance would do. So the whole scene seems kind of contrived to put the Shadow in a position where he needs to be saved by Margo so as to give her some type of importance at this point in the film. How do you think that this scene and the reveal that Tim Curry's character of Cranston was willingly working for Shiwan Khan could have been handled better? Let's start with you, Mr. Hatter.
Well, I actually thought about this question for a while because that is such a weird scene. Who are you going to shoot with that, Claymore? Oh, you can see my footprints. You don't see me. I think what should have happened, first of all, I think you could have given Curry more of a role because he vanishes after his first scene for a long time and then suddenly, oh, we remember this guy. I think you either should have made that a bigger deal, that there was that twist, that we remembered this character, or you should have made him a bigger deal. Maybe found a way to indicate that he could somehow overpower the Shadow as opposed to the Shadow basically slipping on a banana peel. I also think another way could have been, and this is all keeping into the same set piece. I don't know what you could do with a different set piece. Maybe trap him in the lab instead of this big dome that fills with water. But maybe instead of him being shot by Claymore automatically and just kind of tripping up, maybe Shiwan Khan could have had something to do with it. Like, maybe he's involved in a fight with Claymore and then Shiwan Khan comes in and does something that traps the Shadow so he can't get away. And it wouldn't necessarily have helped the Shadow any, but it would have given the scene more sense. You know, it would have been a case of, instead of him very dumbly showing his footprints and trying to run away and psych this guy out in a death trap, it would have been not knowing the death trap was there. And it would have shown, again, Shiwan Khan as a great puppet master, having this planned, knowing it could occur, working things out so that the Shadow would have stumbled and would never have known it.
Yeah, you know, Razorfist, I'm confused by, like, what was even the purpose of that weird water tank? It like, I don't even know what the context of
I'll tell you exactly
was.
I'll tell you exactly what the purpose was. It's so 90s it hurts. No, it is. It's so 90s and so 90s like new wave feminism it hurts. That is a death trap that was intended for Margo Lane. It's absolutely just so that Margo Lane can save the Shadow instead of the other way around. And I don't understand why that's like an women get in trouble too, people. I don't understand why that's a problem. But it should have just been Margo Lane falls into the trap and the Shadow saves her. This is not that hard. Congratulations, scene fixed. It brings them closer together. It makes it clear that the Shadow is watching Margo Lane and clearly is more interested in her. It brings all of the story forward better and more satisfactorily than if the Shadow runs in there, who's supposed to be this tactical genius, and basically tumbles over his own testes and falls face first into a big pool of water, and then Tim Curry, and not a particularly physically fit Tim Curry either,
Nope.
outclasses him. Especially keeping in mind that later in the film, Tim Curry's master plan is shoot a gun a lot of times.
At absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it would make modern Hollywood feminists mad, which is a happy byproduct. But mainly, like in terms of narrative function, it makes a lot more sense for Margo Lane to try and help the Shadow. Maybe you make Margo Lane more of an active agent of the Shadow, and in following a lead, she gets trapped. And you're thinking, actually, and here's an added benefit of that: the Shadow has not come out in day yet. Can he even rescue her in that situation? Will he even rescue her in daytime? You know what I mean?
I was actually going to say that also could work with helping the agents have, well, more agency. We have that scene immediately before where they're discussing the beryllium sphere, and she says, I know Farley Claymore made it. Instead of the Shadow going after Claymore and her going to look information up, The Shadow goes to look up information. We don't know where he's gone. We don't know what he's doing. And so we don't see him again until he comes to save Margo. So that leaves uncertainty. That leaves mystery.
Well,
and it makes her more capable because she has to go out and get the information, and Claymore betrays her and causes a problem. Puts her in the death trap.
You also, to take this even further, you have the setup earlier in the film where Claymore is obviously attracted to Margo.
Oh, yeah.
And so it would make sense for her to go and try to charm him into giving her the sphere. Yeah. So like it makes perfect sense that like she would go and then she'd find out that Claymore is secretly working with Khan and he has to kill her. And so he puts her in this exceptionally slow-moving death trap in order to do so. And she uses her psychic link to reach out to the Shadow and get him to come and save them. So it does seem like this whole thing was backwards. But Razor, I have to disagree with you that that's a 90s thing. That seems to be like something from the 70s to today.
No, it was. But especially there in the 90s, we were getting to the point where the damsel in distress was not allowed anymore. You know what I mean? Like it just was, as a trope, was not allowed. And that, of course, would make her seem like a damsel in distress for 5 seconds. Never mind all the proactive stuff that she did before that to actually help the Shadow. Because she gets in any trouble at all, suddenly it's a damsel in distress. It makes no sense.
But it also felt like they knew that they wanted a scene where like she could go into his dreams and see like his tortured past. And they didn't quite know how to have that happen. So like this was the only way they could think of to wound the Shadow so that he would let his guard down so that she could, see this backstory of his.
Well, I don't think he necessarily had to be wounded for that situation. If you wanted that scene to happen, maybe she gets wounded, he takes her somewhere, she wakes up because she hears him. He doesn't need to be wounded. It can happen anyway. If you're haunted by your past, you don't have to get shot in the shoulder to feel haunted by your past.
Yeah, she could literally just catch him having the freaking nightmare or whatever. You know, you literally could have had basically the exact same sequence sans the wound.
Yeah, it would have been flipped around and it would have worked perfectly. And you still could have had Chitin Curry chewing scenery gloriously.
Or you could have gone one further. If she's going to eventually get hypnotized by Shiwan Khan, maybe she takes the shot and actually wounds him.
Maybe.
Maybe. Would have upped the stakes a little bit and made her feel worse.
Yeah.
Alec Baldwin also recovers really quickly from being shot in this movie. Does the Shadow have enhanced healing ability?
I don't think he's Wolverine.
He has plot device powers.
He does.
The power of Deus Ex Bullet Nia.
So let's talk about this now. Like Batman, the point is made in this film that the Shadow / Lamont Cranston doesn't kill people. Cranston tries his best to stay away from being the evil man that he was at the beginning of the film by not crossing that line into murder, preferring to fight with his fists and intimidate his adversaries rather than kill them, using his guns only as a last resort. Razor, you mentioned earlier that when he falls on that gargoyle on top of that guy, he kills him. He actually didn't kill him. If you listen, the guy kind of groans after he gets off of him. So throughout the movie, he makes a concerted effort not to kill people. He even spares his nemesis, Shiwan Khan, opting not to kill him despite the character plotting to kill millions of people in the city. And yet, for some reason, Cranston kills Tim Curry's character, Claymore, by tricking him into essentially committing suicide. And I think this is something that's kind of more out of the Shadow radio show where he did that type of thing. But it was obvious that, because of, the PG-13 and trying to, launch a new franchise, decisions were made to kind of make the character of the Shadow a lot less kind of dark and evil and murdery. So but what I want to ask you guys is, why do you think this choice was made, and why was Claymore the only person the Shadow actually kills in the movie? Razorfist?
I honestly, I didn't get that from the movie, and I've seen the movie a lot of times. I didn't get he never kills. I definitely got he doesn't want to be an unholy bastard. That's more what I got. I didn't get that he never kills. I mean, for Christ's sake, what's he lugging around 245 government model automatics for? If he's not,
they look pretty.
Yeah, right. Like, it doesn't make any sense. He clearly kills. It's just it's hands off. It is like the radio show in that sense, because the shadow of the radio show did kill people. He absolutely did. They found clever Hays Code ways around it, and honestly, most of the time, the ways that he engineered in kind of a roundabout way, those were way more gruesome. Some guy would like take a swing at him and he'd wind up being, electrocuted, or how many people fell out of freaking windows. I mean,
forcing a guy to hold a grenade.
Forcing a guy to hold a live grenade. I mean, the whole thing. He absolutely. I honestly think that's what it is. I didn't get a "I will not kill" vibe. There was definitely not that, and at least not that I remember explicitly stated in the movie. Just kind of an aversion to murdering for its own sake. Certainly.
It wasn't ever specifically stated, but if you look at the movie very carefully, like even the guys that he shoots, the bullets bounce off their armor and the impact from the bullets just like knock them out.
I do think it was neutered. I do agree. I think it was neutered for the PG-13. Like this, a Shadow movie would be a crime movie, and a well-done crime movie is usually going to be an R. So unfortunately, you really can't have the Shadow just unloading on people constantly without and retain that PG-13 rating. So,
but JJ, why do you think Cranston was the only one that he killed in the movie actively? Do you think it was because Tim Curry's performance was overshadowing everything else?
First of all, Claymore. Second of all, well, if you found out he was going to be in a Barbie movie, wouldn't you want to get rid of him?
Right?
In all seriousness, I kind of wondered that myself. I agree with Razor. I didn't get the sense that he never kills. I got the sense more that he felt, I don't need to kill right now. And in some ways, I think, for example, with Shiwan Khan's defeat, debatable if he spared him. I'd say what happens to Shiwan Khan is for Shiwan Khan worse than death. It was more a matter of, it did have to be cut down because it was PG-13, and I think that is the thing that kept it back. Because the Shadow in the comics and even in the radio show had no compunctions. He would go about it in different ways, but he had no problem with very sadistically killing people. Curry felt like sort of, maybe that scene was meant to be a callback, because it's the best way to put it is most shadowy death scene. Where he forces a guy to jump out a window to his doom while laughing about it.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that was why it was in there, was, okay, we can't do all these crazy death scenes, and we can't have him shooting everybody on sight because of the PG-13 rating. But let's do one. Let's do one that feels straight out of the radio show, where in the radio show you'd have like a guy would pull a live grenade and he'd go, "Don't drop it. Hear my voice. Hold on to it. Don't drop it until the guy blows up." He doesn't show mercy. It's just he doesn't do it directly either. He basically forces them to do it themselves. Yeah. So I think that was the idea, was to give that one moment because they couldn't do so much more. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I just found it very inconsistent because, I mean, there's literally a scene where he saves a Shiwan Khan minion from falling off a building, and he like grabs onto his hand, and the guy's trying to commit suicide basically, and he's like, you'll die, and he's like, "I'll die in service to my Khan." So like it just seems weird that he would go out of his way to like save the life of a minion, and then just blatantly murder Tim Curry.
That one, I think it was he needed to get information, and he wanted to get information. I don't think it had anything to do with valuing the minion's life. I think it was more that he wanted to know something. He says, "Where is Khan?" That is his first question. And I think that was why he saved him. He wanted to know. Now, why he couldn't have found out other ways and so forth, that's another issue.
Yeah. All right. So normally the climax of Cranston's character arc in this film would be him achieving mastery over his powers by coming to peace with his darker nature. His acceptance of his dark heart would allow him to become more powerful, granting him the powers of telekinesis and control of the magic dagger Furba, which can only be successfully controlled by a mind that is at peace. However, none of this is actually set up within the narrative of the movie, despite it being implied. So what I want to ask you guys is, how could this character's climax been better set up within the story, in your opinion? Razor?
If I'm making that movie, that dagger isn't even in it. I do not understand. And it's funny because CGI wise, it might be one of the things that holds up the best, strangely enough, as terrible as it is. But I just don't get that at all. Especially when the stakes here are a nuclear weapon goes off in New York, but really what we're fighting over is a letter opener. Like, what? What? I get that it has a mean face, but you know what I mean? I don't get that very, very much at all. If I'm writing it, it's not in there, period. It would 100% be probably, I mean, if you're going to hijack New York with a nuclear weapon, I would think that's enough of a motivation to want to take a guy down, color me persnickety. I'm thinking I'd probably be looking into taking that guy down.
But I think it's more of an issue of the character of the Shadow, because he couldn't control this dagger, it was endemic of him not actually having mastery over his powers. And then eventually we see him kind of come to terms with or become at peace with the fact that he's a bad person, and that kind of gives him the power to, utilize control over that dagger. JJ, what do you think could have been done to better communicate this character arc and the climax of the character arc?
I actually concur 100% with Razor. Earlier, I said that my big problem with the movie more than anything else was the lackluster action, which may or may not have been due to cuts and stuff like that. I actually feel the knife kind of factors into that too, and it's another problem as well I have. It never really felt like it needed to be there. And it's so strange that this big climactic moment, instead of this great fight between these two characters or this horde of minions, he's literally wrestling with something I would put on my mantelpiece to hold down paper. It's just so weird, and it looks silly in my opinion. And so it just struck me as what should have been done was, if you wanted to keep kind of the same character arc, and we've said this again and again and again throughout this video, and I have to stress, I do like Shiwan Khan in this movie, but this is an issue. It should have been something more along the lines of outwitting Shiwan Khan as opposed to fighting over a talking knife. It should have been something along the lines of, my mind is my greatest asset, not just in terms of my psychic powers, but in terms of I can outthink you, I can outwit you, I can find a way to get around you. That should have been what the character arc was, if anything. It shouldn't have been about not mastering his powers, because part of the Shadow's mystique is that he is a master of his powers. And that's where the agents come in. So, again, if, just like Razor said, if it were up to me, the knife would not have been involved at all. The purple would not have been involved at all. I don't even know is that in anything besides this movie. I can't recall seeing it in any of the comics or hearing about it in any of the radio shows. And again, I've only read a few of the pulps.
Nope.
Well, there you go. Then why was it even there? Get rid of it.
Yeah, I don't. It just seemed like some Eastern mysticism BS. I don't know if they got it from. It seems like one of the big inspirations was a radio show called The Temple Bells of Nabon, which was like the second or third episode of the Shadow radio show.
I actually have heard that episode.
Yeah, it's a classic. And I don't know, there's just a lot of weird Eastern mysticism type crap in that. And I'm thinking maybe David Koepp was, I don't know, maybe he had a little hookah going or something. a little the wacky tobacco, a little Bogota's best going on.
He was talking to the caterpillar on his mushroom.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
jamming some Grateful Dead and put that down on the page. I don't know. There is a really weird sequence that's actually really cool. It's actually aged very well, where Shiwan Khan is doing his Shiwan Khan stuff, and he's waving his arms around, and then
yes, at the carpet to find Roy Tam. That has aged well.
The carpet becomes like a roiling, diaphanous, mystical kind of intaglio in the sky. Like it becomes this really cool, and that actually looks pretty awesome.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have minded having more of that and a little less dagger.
Agreed.
Yeah. The living dagger does seem more like a Mulcahy thing. Like he's like, I want a flying dagger in the movie.
You're not wrong. It's very Highlander.
Yeah, it really is. So
that might be the case.
While we're on the subject of the dagger, let's talk about the character of Tulku, the holy man, and what he means to Cranston. So we only see Tulku, Cranston's master, in the film's prologue, where he essentially tells Cranston that he will be forced to redeem himself for his evil ways. But we never get to see the relationship between these men form. It literally skips from their introduction right to New York City about 8 years later. Yet when Shiwan Khan shows up and reveals that he killed Tulku, it seemed as though both Cranston and the audience should feel something about this, despite not getting to know the character all that much. And in fact, the revelation of Tulku's death seems to have no effect on Cranston whatsoever. And thus, it's kind of a hollow revelation for the audience as well, because if he doesn't care, why should we? So how do you think the character of Tulku could have been handled and his relationship with Cranston strengthened so that the audience would actually care when it's revealed that he's been murdered? Mr. Hatter, what do you think?
Well, that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about maybe showing more of his, if we wanted to, showing more of his creation into the shadow from Yinko. Or maybe just moving that scene where we find out how it started to another point. What if instead of opening the film with him in Tibet as Yinko, and I think Razor suggested this earlier, instead starting the film in New York, already the shadow, has been the shadow for a while, and then later in the film, if we want to reveal more, we learn more then. So you could have had that scene maybe take place before that scene in the Chinese restaurant. So that even though we only get that one scene with Tulku, he's fresher in our minds. And so we can maybe and so that maybe we can have more of a connection. Or just having more of him, maybe one other scene with him, so that we know what he was like during that course of time. But it's hard to say without like ruining the mystery of the shadow and how he came about and who he is. That's always the balancing act you kind of have to work with.
Yeah.
Razor, what do you think could have been done to strengthen the audience's connection with the mentor character?
I wouldn't have even put him in the movie personally. In my version, he wouldn't have even been in there. But in terms of the version that we're working with, maybe it would have enhanced the menace of the dagger and of the Tulku to have some kind of funky situation where it requires like a soul to power it or something. And you find out that the Tulku's soul is what's powering the dagger or some such. You know, it's the only thing I can think of to make it more impactful. And then by defeating Shiwan Khan, he also frees the soul of his master or something. You know, I don't know. I'm spitballing here. I think it's a stupid idea. I don't think the Tulku should have been in there at all. I always hate when the comics try and create this whole origin story, this backstory where, you know, in the Far East or whatever, it reads like the least interesting elements of Batman's backstory.
It really does. And I think my biggest issue with it was that it felt like we were expected to care, and yet they did nothing to make us care. And I think that's lazy storytelling and lazy writing, you know, just embodied right there. So let's talk about...
He was huffing black flowers in a Himalayan monastery.
It also bothered me. It also bothered me that the Tulku's voice was obviously not that actor's voice.
Actually, I know who provided that voice. It was an actor named Barry Denon. He was really well known in musicals. He was also in The Dark Crystal. And he even was in video games. He was one of the Metal Gear Solid games. Pretty big voice actor and stuff. Why they had him do the Tulku's voice, I have no idea. I think it was that the original actor's voice was really heavily accented and they couldn't understand it. But why they decided to give him that voice, which so clearly did not match what we were seeing, was... I don't know if that was intentional or not, and if it was intentional, what it was supposed to serve.
I think they tried to find someone's voice that was similar to Alec Baldwin's, and tried to have that kind of mirror back to him, you know, what he was saying. But I mean, that's all speculation at this point. It was just a very odd choice, in my opinion. So let's talk about the actual climax of the movie, which is the Hall of Mirrors scene. The actual climax of the film scene is rather abrupt, with the final showdown between Cranston and Khan happening without all that much buildup, actually. Like, I think JJ mentioned earlier that the shadow just kind of flops over, but it was like somehow the
floor moved.
The floor tilted and threw him off balance.
Yeah, the floor tilted and he fell over.
And that's a weird thing. That's a weird thing to have in a hotel that you bought through a couple shell companies.
That's odd.
This gyroscopic.
That was the kids' playroom area.
Yeah. But you know, this is probably because
opening a great skate. It was a roller skating rink.
Oh yes.
So one of the reasons that the climax of this film probably feels a little bit rushed and anticlimactic is that the Hall of Mirrors set that was supposed to be used in the film's climactic scene, the final battle between Cranston and Khan, was actually destroyed in an earthquake during filming. And this kind of forced the filmmakers to truncate the final confrontation because they didn't have the money or time to rebuild the set and shoot it the way they originally envisioned it. So, Razor, how do you think the film's climax could have been changed or altered to be more satisfying? I know you said that you read the comic adaptation that was based on alternate script, but if you were working with what they had to work with, how do you think they could have structured things to make it play out a bit better?
Well, I mean, the comic version pretty well nails it. You just have him fight more henchmen, for crying out loud. It's as simple as that. I mean, when you're fighting Rita Repulsa, you know you're going to have to fight a bunch of putties first. All right? That's how it works. And that's part of the big climax in any movie. The Ninja Turtles had to kick a whole lot of foot soldier ass before they got to the Shredder. That's how it works. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, we don't have that. The Shadow shows up and he does the thing and then the floor moves. That's it. It's really weird. It's still cool and climactic, mainly because of how it's shot. Here again, the cinematographer kind of saves the day here.
Agreed.
But it is, I think, easily the sequence that Michael Kaluta wrote and drew in the movie adaptation would have perfectly worked. He fights a bunch of bad guys and he's shooting them all. Of course, maybe that's a rating thing, maybe that's a PG-13 thing, but he's basically unloading on a bunch of Mongol warriors and what have you. And then they have the big fight. Now, of course, the set was destroyed, but the original idea was, if you've watched The Lady from Shanghai, it was literally the ending of that. And I think, honestly, the moving floor is a reference to Lady from Shanghai. If you watch the end of that, it takes place in a fun house. They're on sort of a beach, this carnival. And so they go into this Hall of Mirrors, fun house, whatever. And it's this really crazy, like psychedelic almost. It's one of the most visionary sequences, honestly, of Orson Welles' entire career, which is saying a lot as a director.
I've seen that film and I do agree.
And it's this brilliant sequence where you're not quite sure what's real. And it's vaguely like expressionistic and really straight. He's like going through walls that are kind of doors and they're not. You're not sure where everything is in space. And then he spills down this big slide and there's this big turning platform that spits Orson Welles out the other side, and then he comes to the Hall of Mirrors. And I think that was the idea. I think the spinning floor was supposed to sort of roll him into this Hall of Mirrors sequence. And unfortunately, because the set was destroyed, they had to sort of chop all that off. It probably sounded pretty cool to Russell Mulcahy, but unfortunately Mother Nature disagreed.
Hatter, what do you think could have been done to enhance the climax of the movie?
Well, given that the set was destroyed, and given I haven't read I'm sorry to say it, I haven't read the graphic novel adaptation. I wanted to for a while, but I just haven't gotten the chance. What I think should have been done, keeping those things in mind, apparently they actually did, I could be wrong, but I think they actually did shoot a scene of the Shadow fighting the Mongol warriors. But for whatever reason, that was cut for time, which is dumb. I think you should have kept that, first of all, or moved it in some way, so that instead of walking in, and this goes back to the Purba being useless, why is it there, walks in, Yinko, I surrender. You're finished, Khan. And then all of the henchmen jump out at some point.
Right.
And cue the spinning floor, cue the fight scene, guns down all the henchmen. And then, if you absolutely must have that frickin' knife there, then it comes into play. And just as he's defeated all the bad guys, stabs him in the gut, and that's where we get into that part. Once he's pulled the knife out, once he's taken care of that, and he sent Shiwan Khan, stabbed him and revealed the hotel, if you wanted to keep going, instead of having the sequence of Mr. Magoo and Margo trying to disarm the bomb, have maybe just one or two moments of that, and then him pursuing Shiwan Khan through like that place before he got to the Hall of Mirrors.
Right.
You got to have a fight there.
You got a guy with two guns and a spinning floor.
Exactly.
How is there never a moment where the shadow spins around and shoots all the Mongol warriors in I mean, the Matrix stole his outfit and his little shoulder holes. Let's be real. Like, the Wachowskis watched the hell out of this movie. Let's not lie. They watched this. It's basically how Keanu Reeves is dressed in the Matrix. But I mean, how is there not a sequence where he does the, Kate Beckinsale underworld thing?
And now I'm imagining Keanu Reeves as the Shadow. I have no idea whether to hate it or love
it. Well, hey, you're breathtaking. But I guess my bigger question here is what is a room full of mirrors doing in this hotel that this guy bought through a couple of shell companies? I mean, it literally seems shoehorned in there. It's like, hey, let's have a big showdown in a hall of mirrors. Doesn't make any sense. Just like the shifting floor doesn't make sense. But I guess like he had time to create these things while, he hypnotized the city into not seeing this place.
Look, I know I'm going to have a big battle at the end. We need to make this as thematic as possible.
Yeah, I mean, like visually it's very cool, but it just logically doesn't make a whole lot of sense there. But I guess you don't watch a movie like this for the logic of it. You watch it for the kitschy enjoyment in a certain sense. But speaking of the quality of this film, Entertainment Weekly gave The Shadow a grade of D and placed it on its 21 worst comic book movies ever list. This film has also not withstood the test of time, at least in my opinion. I know you guys disagree with me, because its visual effects look extremely dated, and the film was ultimately lost to audiences outside of the fans of the classic pulp source material in comic books. So what I want to ask you guys is, in your opinion, what would it take to make a good Shadow movie and launch a successful film franchise based on the character? And what would you like to see for the future of this character, not only on the big screen, but also on other media like television, books, and comic books? JJ, let us know what you think.
Well, first of all, in terms of a big budget live action film, and I am speaking not as a fan, I'm speaking as a practical person. I don't know if you would be able to do it and make it successful. You could try, and I would love it if they try. And I think if they tried, what they should do is basically do what this film did, only better. All of the things we've discussed that we found problems with, Shiwan Khan not being a mastermind, the knife and the Tulku maybe not having much of a point, maybe giving the agents more agency, and so forth. If you had taken those elements, mixed the things that worked in this film, and mashed them together, set it in period with a great actor behind it, you could have a good movie. Now, keeping in mind that it isn't the most well-known franchise, I think, nowadays, and there would be sort of a niche group that would like it. If you wanted something that would appeal to them without losing you money, again, do an animated series or an animated movie that's direct to video. Do something that'll get those fans interested and might catch attention. Right. So that maybe you can promote it before you try and do something big like that.
Which was probably one of the big mistakes they made in the production of this movie. There was a video game that was supposed to come out ahead of it.
Yeah.
Video game wound up getting delayed and didn't come out before the movie. Movie came out, wasn't that much of a success. They canceled the game, even though it was finished, by the way.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. I think that the answer to this question is they need to give Razorfist $100 million and just let him make it.
Absolutely.
No, my idea definitely would be make a movie the same way Walter Gibson wrote a pulp, because the great thing about the way Walter Gibson wrote the pulps was that he was a magician. So as a prestidigitator, he understood how to draw an audience in that may not necessarily be interested. Even the name, The Shadow, is designed to draw you in. It automatically makes you ask the question, well, who the hell is the Shadow? Who's going to call themselves the Shadow? Looking at the Shadow, looking at this cloaked dude in a hat. I mean, enough movies have ripped off this look. All right. It's not like it's not marketable.
Not to mention cartoons.
Yes. So if you're looking at a poster with this character on it and it's called The Shadow, you're already going to get a bunch of people who wouldn't otherwise, they don't have to be avowed fans to be interested. So my advice would be make a story the way Walter Gibson did. In other words, make a good crime story where the bad guys win, and then plop the Shadow in at regular intervals so they don't win. It's as simple as that. It really is. And follow the story of an agent as he sees, as you see through human eyes, through a normal person's eyes, this ethereal, bizarre, spectral figure of the Shadow, and slowly speculate who this guy is and how this peal of evil laughter suddenly is reverberating through the warehouse while the mobsters are doing their deal, and suddenly they're all laying dead in a hail of bullets. Like, who is this guy? What is motivating him? You're hearing stories from the different mobsters. They think that he's a dead aviation hero, or he's an aviation hero in World War I. And one of them caught a glimpse of his face, and there was no face there. It was just a bandage. Like, is this the wounded World War I hero that the criminals are all afraid of? Or is this just some rumor? Is it, I wouldn't even bother casting Lamont Cranston in a first movie. I'd leave the Shadow as the Shadow and have him be this just spectral force that comes in, and mostly you're following the crime, and the Shadow is an active participant, and he's giving directions, and he's certainly going to have lines, but you're mostly following through the eyes of an agent on the ground level. That'd be I'd probably mix the Living Shadow pulp with maybe another story called Gangnam's Doom it was a pulp story, but it was adapted later on into the Shadow Strikes comic book. It's really good. It's basically just the Shadow versus Al Capone. And I'd probably mix those two. He saves Harry Vincent, and then he enlists Harry Vincent in a takedown of the Chicago mob at the height of Prohibition. I think that'd be cool.
That kind of leads me into one other suggestion. I think one thing that could give you possibly some success, both in terms of the revenue you get back and in terms of attracting people, don't make it a movie, make it a TV show.
Yeah.
Because then you would be guaranteed a whole season. And if every episode is like half an hour to an hour, you're going to get a lot more footage than you get out of a movie. And if you get someone relatively well known, maybe not a big star, but someone relatively well known to play that part, or just freaking really good, then you'll attract people. The Shadow, a TV series, this actor I love, what's it going to be like? And if you're lucky, that first season will lead to a second season and so forth. And maybe a movie later on.
Well, and that's another thing is people are a lot less likely to roll the dice on a movie they don't know anything about than they are to roll the dice on a streaming service, because they're already paying for the streaming service.
Exactly.
So if there's a new show that's out and it's got some cool promo images, hey, who's this Undertaker looking dude in a cloak with two automatics, wasting shit bags in Prohibition era America, like, who is this? They're going to roll the dice.
It would be like, I think they would be interested, because it would basically, I can already see the tabloids saying things like Daredevil crossed with Boardwalk Empire. I'm not saying that's what it would be. I'm just saying that's what people might say.
Right.
That would get people interested.
Let me throw this out there. What do you think are the odds that some brilliant mind in Hollywood would pitch a pulp era cinematic universe with the Shadow, Doc Savage, the Phantom, all these like Silver Age pulp era characters like Buck Rogers and stuff like that, the Flash Gordon, all these characters in a single cinematic universe?
I happen to know Michael Uslan has done that already. Has pitched that. He has pitched the Shadow Green Hornet at least. In fact, I'm pretty sure the Shadow Green Hornet comic that he wrote was just his movie treatment. I'm pretty sure. And it kind of reads
They've done that before.
Yeah, it kind of reads that way a little bit. So I know that's been pitched. Or some minor variant of that. But yeah, that'd be kind of cool. The great thing, of course, about the Shadow is he's not the only pulp property owned by Condé Nast. There's actually a whole stable of pulp characters that they own, including Doc Savage. So, and here's the great news for Shadow fans. Doc Savage is happening. The Rock has signed on for it. He's going to be Doc Savage. If Doc Savage does well, the probability of a Shadow movie just shot through the roof. You know what I mean? It's way more likely you're getting a Shadow movie if Doc Savage is successful. And with The Rock playing the main character, you've improved your odds a fair amount.
Yeah, with Jason Statham playing the Shadow.
Nothing else will come to see him.
Yeah, plus I think he's a good choice, too.
I agree. I haven't read much of Doc Savage, but what I have read, I agree.
As long as you don't get Jason Statham to play the Shadow, I think that
Woof.
would be that might be a bad call. So before we get going here, guys, before we wrap things up, I want to talk a little bit about Walter Gibson, because in my research for this podcast, I watched some of Razorfist stuff, and I haven't really had a chance to read any of the pulp novels, unlike you guys. But I am a professional author. I make my money off of selling my books, and the amount of product that Mr. Gibson put out, I think Razorfist said something, out of 200 something Shadow novels, he wrote like 180 of them, totaling how many million words?
Over 300 novels. He wrote 200 and something, 280 odd. Something like less than 30 or 40 or something were written by other people. And the ones that were written by people that he basically handpicked.
Yeah. So I have massive respect for this guy, because not only was his output phenomenal, but according to Razorfist, the books were actually all really good. So not only was he able to put out 2 full-length novels a month, basically, but he was able to make sure that they were actually like good novels. And so major respect for him as a fellow author. What do you guys think of Walter Gibson before we get out of here, Razor?
He was an American treasure. Like, this is a guy who should be celebrated in terms of just American literature because of what he was able to accomplish. I mean, this is a guy who, never mind the record or whatever, which he actually set. He set Walter B. Gibson set a world record for the most, that still stands today, for the most number of words written about a single fictional subject or a single fictional character, I believe. Still standing to this day. And it's not surprising when you consider not only was he writing that many Shadow novels, but he was writing longer pulp novels than most people were. Right? Like when they reprint these, they're something like 60 odd pages. The average pulp story was shorter than that. It was about half that, in fact. So he was doing like a double length pulp. And keep in mind, he was writing the Shadow pulp at the same time that he was writing a radio drama. He didn't write the Shadow radio drama. For some reason, they didn't want him to, although there's been speculation he might have ghostwritten a couple of episodes without letting anyone know. But he was writing a radio drama called Chick Carter, Kid Detective or whatever. It's a spinoff of Nick Carter, who's an American detective character, predates Sherlock Holmes, actually, and a character owned by Street and Smith that served as the inspiration for the Shadow. So he's writing a radio show. He's writing a pulp. It's twice monthly. It's bi-weekly. This pulp was for a long time, in fact, for most of the 30s. And he's writing the Shadow comic book as he's doing that. And he's consulting, like Walter B. Gibson was consulted on a lot of Shadow related stuff. He consulted on the 1940 Columbia radio serial that you referenced earlier, which is one of the reasons it's so good. Actually, it's like a combination of 2 Shadow pulps basically smashed together. It's why it's so damn good, and probably the truest version of the Shadow we've ever gotten on the screen. Big success too for them. So in all of that, he's doing that, and he was working for the Great Blackstone, and he's writing a bunch of. I think he was editing a magic journal at the time. I mean, this guy, apparently he would have to take a couple days off after he was done writing just to rest his fingertips. I mean, the guy was a madman. He was described as a compulsive writer. But more than that, he cared about the quality. Like the way that he described writing a Shadow story, it was like his fingertips could not catch up with his ideas. Like he could barely keep up because it was just like a gigantic stream of consciousness. He was constantly thinking of Shadow stories and writing them down and trying to get them down as fast as possible. So he kept the quality pretty high. He got a formula down. He was fiercely disciplined. That goes without saying. Where he would, he had formulas, he kind of broke it down into categories. I've got mysteries. I've got supervillain stories. I've got globe trekking stories or whatever. He had like different molds that he would fit all the stories in so that he could keep the variety going, so it didn't get old, which is one of the reasons The Shadow was such a top-selling pulp magazine for the entirety of the 30s, well into the 40s. Really what wound up taking down The Shadow and a lot of other pulps was World War II came along, and suddenly there was a paper shortage, and so they dropped the pulps to like quarterly again, and then sales dropped off because people didn't have access to them as much, and it just kind of didn't come back after World War II. Unfortunately. But Walter Gibson, if I had my druthers, this guy would be, I mean, for crying out loud, we praise Bob Kane, who basically was a professional thief. We praise Bill Finger, who was kind of the same thing, but at least he admitted it. Walter B. Gibson, few people know who he is. And he's not just a formative figure in pulps. I mean, he's basically the reason the superhero exists. And the entire comic industry that we have now, which is now, I mean, we know what a big deal that is in Hollywood. But he was a hugely important figure in magic and illusionism as well. He was hugely important in, he was Harry Houdini's biographer. He designed the last illusion for Harry Houdini that he never was able to perform because he died. The Chinese sticks routine, which you can see performed on YouTube, I'm sure. Classic illusion that Walter B. Gibson designed himself. And that's probably why The Shadow works so well, and one of the reasons it's such a classic man of mystery, because this is a guy who understood sleight of hand in more ways than one. He knew that for every question you answered, you needed to ask 2 more. And he did that all throughout the history of The Shadow, and that's why it works. And one day, God willing, we'll get that version on the screen, the version that you never quite figure out, because I think that version is a version of The Shadow that audiences are going to find a lot more interesting. They certainly did in the 40s. He was a baron of all media at that time.
Are you saying that he invented the mystery box before J.J. Abrams?
kind of, a little bit.
It's funny because Stephen King, who has like 60 novels under his belt, is considered to be one of the most prolific authors in history. And here is Walter Gibson with 280 books, and nobody knows who he is virtually. It's a real shame. JJ, do you have anything to say about Walter Gibson?
Well, I'm going to start and say, again, as I said at the beginning, I've only read 3 of the pulps. Specifically, I've read The Black Hush, The 5 Chameleons, and The Voodoo Master.
Nice.
Yes. Anyway, but what I can say is that despite only reading 3 pulps, I have immense respect for Walter B. Gibson for pretty much every reason that's already been listed. I'm going to say it right now. As Razor was just talking about him, it gave me the idea, what if you could make a movie or a play about this man and just what he accomplished? Yeah. It would be kind of interesting if you could do that, because he had such a prolific life.
Well, they did that with Tolkien. Why not?
They did that with Tolkien. They did that with Charles Dickens. They've done it with a lot of writers. This is a guy who really needs it. Yeah. You'd probably bring the Shadow in, too. He could be almost your Ghost of Christmas Past type thing there. I don't know.
Yeah, he had an interesting life, too. He was involved in the first, what became an annual Harry Houdini seance, which is famous now. I mean, that the Harry Houdini seance is like urban legend. And he was involved in the first several. And for many, many years after that, he became acquainted with Orson Welles, which is one of the interesting things about Orson Welles is there's this perception that like Orson Welles did the radio show, and he was like celebrity guy and they just barely got him to do it. No, Orson Welles loved The Shadow. In fact, later on in the 40s, when he was like kind of hamstrung by his success with Citizen Kane, Orson Welles explored the possibility of directing and starring in a film version of The Shadow.
I've heard of that. One of history's great missed opportunities.
Yeah, he was looking to kind of do a film noir of The Shadow, and that would have been very, very interesting. He was well acquainted with Walter Gibson. Walter Gibson himself alluded many times to Orson Welles wanting to do a film version of The Shadow. So, would have been really, really cool. Would have been cool, but Walter Gibson had a very interesting life, and interestingly enough, probably the most apropos way to go. You can possibly imagine he died with a half-finished Shadow story in his typewriter.
How very poetically ironic.
Indeed.
That's a shame. All right, guys. Well, we've talked a lot about this movie, probably more than anyone else has ever done so in the history of cinema. Why don't we wrap things up by telling everyone where they can find out more about you, JJ Hatter? Where can people learn more about you and what you do?
At present, there are two places. There's me on DeviantArt, just under JJ Hatter. That's where I'm most prolific. I create a series of lists, top 10s, top 5s, top 12s on various subjects. Comics, movies, TV, just basically anything that comes to my head. I've actually done a few lists for The Shadow, though they're kind of outdated. I should probably go back and fix that. Another place you can find me, but I'm a little newer there, is YouTube under the name JJ Hatter 3. And that is a spot where I have I've been making a series of video reviews. Right now I'm focusing on Alice in Wonderland and different adaptations of that because it goes with the name. But I am hoping to branch out to other things in the future as well.
All right. Mr. Fist, you have one of the greatest YouTube channels I think I've ever seen. Where can people find out more about you and where can they check out your YouTube channel?
Sure. Hit me up. I mean, my central website will pretty much link you everywhere. It's just a Tumblr blog. It's the-rageaholic.tumblr.com. Very simple. Twitter.com/Razorfist with a 0. Also is kind of a hub of activity for my channel and everything else. There's links there. And my YouTube channel, of course, just look up Razorfist of the Rageaholic on the YouTube because the URL is ridiculous because thanks YouTube, they gave my name to somebody else years and years ago for a completely inactive channel.
Dum-dums.
Indeed.
Anyway, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you very much to my special guest for this wonderfully insightful Roundtable Reviews episode. This is Matthew Kadish. God frickin' speed. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the video. Please check us out on our socials. You can find us on Facebook at eggfbgroup.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Matthew Kadish, Kadish. You can find us on Instagram at Matthew Kadish as well. You can also find us on Patreon. Support us by going to www.kadishdonate.com. And subscribe to us on YouTube at kadishvideo.com. We update our channel regularly. Finally, check us out on Amazon at kadishbooks.com, Kadish books.com. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Matthew Kadish, and I will catch you later.